The sun rose slow over the cracked Texas grass. A stretch of fence hung, cut clean, the wire coiled neat on the dirt like a warning left in plain sight. A woman stood alone at the post, taller than the gate, shoulders that filled the empty air, hands large enough to close around the broken ends as if they weighed nothing. She pulled once. The wire snapped taut. One hand was all it took. A fresh scrap of paper was pinned into the wood. Two rough words. No signature. Out on the road, dust lifted high. Hoofbeats carried clear on the wind more than one set. The creek below ran thinner than it ever should. In her pocket, an older survey scrap still held its heat from weeks before. She lifted her head. The rifle leaned against the post. The riders took shape on the horizon, closing the distance with every stride. The sun came up over Timberline Ranch the way it always did. Slow, orange, like it was afraid of what it might find. Ingrid Voss was already awake. She'd been awake since before the birds, since before the coyotes stopped their business out past the ridge, since the kind of hour that didn't have a name yet, just a color, gray-blue, cold enough to bite. She stood at the well, pulling the rope hand over hand, and the bucket came up so fast it nearly cleared the stone lip on its own. Because that was the thing about Ingrid. She didn't pull like other people pulled. She didn't need two hands, and a foot braced against the wall and a grunt at the end of it. One hand. That was all it took. She was 6'10" in her boots, 6'8" without them, and she went without them most mornings because boots on hardwood at 5 a.m. woke nobody up faster than a gunshot. Her shoulders filled a doorway the way most men's shoulders filled a chair. Her hands could palm a horse's skull, could close around a fence post and pull it clean out of dry Texas dirt like it was a weed. She was not, and had never been, delicate. The town called her other things instead. There had been a name for her once, before any of that, before the whispers, before the careful way people's eyes did the flick, up and up again, before they caught themselves and looked away. Wife. That had been the name once. And before that, further back than she liked to travel most mornings, mother twice over for a span of time so short it hardly seemed fair to call it a span at all. Eric Voss had never once flinched at the size of her. Not the first day she'd walked into his father's mercantile, in St. Louis, 18 years old and already taller than every man in the room. Mortified by it, in a way, she'd spend the next decade learning to unlearn. Not the day he'd asked to walk her home, in front of a street full of people who'd stared at the two of them together like they were watching some traveling curiosity roll through town. Not the day he'd gone down on one knee, which had required him to look up at her even more than usual. And he'd laughed about it, right there in the moment. Laughed, like it was the funniest and finest thing in the world, and asked her anyway. "I don't want a woman I have to bend down to love," he'd told her once, out here on this very land. The two of them, young and unafraid, and certain the whole world was going to be kind to people who worked hard and loved true. "I want one I have to look up to." Figured I got lucky, finding one in both senses of the word. She hadn't understood, back then, how much a person could lose and still be expected to get up the next morning and pull water from a well. Two children, a boy first, then a girl 11 months apart, the way some were blessed and cursed in the same breath. Neither one had seen a second winter. The fever had come through in the spring of 1880 and taken half the infants in the county along with it, and there had been no explaining it, no reason to it, no comfort the minister could offer that didn't sound, to Ingrid's ear, like something recited rather than believed. Eric had held her the night they buried the second one, had wrapped both arms all the way around her, no small thing, given the size of her, but he'd always managed it somehow, always found a way to make his arms feel like enough, and told her the ranch would still be there in the morning, and so would he, and so, God willing, would she, and that was the whole of what they had to hold on to, and it would have to be sufficient. It had been sufficient for one more year, then the fire. She didn't let herself walk all the way into that memory most mornings, just the edges of it, the smell of smoke that didn't belong to any campfire, the sound she'd made running from the house, a sound she hadn't recognized as her own voice until long after. The particular, useless strength of her own two hands, strong enough to tear a fence post from dry ground, not strong enough to hold back flame, not strong enough to have gotten there 1 minute sooner, not strong enough for the one thing. In her whole life, she would have traded every ounce of it to be strong enough for. She had never fully believed the fire was an accident. Men in town had said as much gently. Weeks after bad luck, dry summer, an overturned lamp, these things happened on ranches all the time. But there had been trouble that spring too. Trouble she'd never spoken of to anyone, not even Abel. A different set of men, back then, with a different set of interests, in timberlines, water, and grass. Men who'd since moved on, or been run off, or simply vanished the way trouble sometimes did when it got what it wanted some other way. She had buried her suspicion along with her husband, because grief left no room for anything else, and because accusing a ghost of murder wasn't going to bring anyone back either way. But she had never quite let the suspicion go, either. It sat folded away in the same part of her that kept the surveyor's scrap, the same part that noticed pauses in a stranger's answers, the same part that had learned, the hard way, that peace on 400 acres of good grass and better water was never as permanent as it looked from the porch at sunrise. She set the bucket down, looked out over the land. 400 acres of grass gone gold at the edges, and a creek that ran low this year, lower than she liked, lower than it should. She could see the barn from here, the one Abel had helped her rebuild after the fire took the first one. She could see the fence line she'd walked 1,000 times, mending, checking, mending again. She could not see her husband, could not see her babies, because they were up on the rise behind the barn, under 2 winters' worth of grass, and no amount of looking would ever change that. Ingrid picked up the bucket, walked toward the house, didn't let herself stop at the rise, not this morning. She had learned, the hard way, that some mornings you didn't stop, or you didn't start again. "You're up early," Abel said from the porch, like he hadn't heard her at the well for the last 20 minutes. "Every morning's early," Ingrid said. That a fact. Fact enough. Abel Whitfield was 70 years old and built like a fence post that had given up trying to stand up straight. He wore spectacles that had been patched with wire. So many times they looked more wire than glass, and he could not see 30 feet without them, and he refused, on principle, to admit any of it. He was also the only hired hand left on 400 acres that used to run 6. "Coffee's on," he said. "You made coffee?" "I attempted coffee. Lord help us. Lord's had worse jobs." She almost smiled, almost. It had been getting easier lately, the almost. Some days it even made it all the way to a smile, before she caught it and put it away again, because smiling felt like something she hadn't earned yet, some debt she hadn't paid off. Grief was funny that way. It didn't leave, it just got quieter. Sat in the corner of every room, waiting to remind you it was still there the second you forgot. She sat down across from Abel, took the coffee. It was terrible. "This is terrible," she said. "I know it. Why do you keep making it?" Then, "Because someone's got to keep trying things around here," Abel said. And there was something under it, something that wasn't about coffee at all. And Ingrid heard it and didn't answer, because some mornings you just let a thing sit instead of poking at it. They drank the terrible coffee in silence, until Abel said, "Fence held up all right last night." "Which part?" "North stretch. The part Reyes cut Tuesday." Ingrid set the cup down, carefully, because when she wasn't careful, cups had a way of not surviving contact with her hands. "He came back?" "Didn't say he came back." Difference between the two. "Abel, I checked it myself. Twice. Nothing cut. Nothing loose. That's not an answer. Best I got." She looked out at the land again, at the fence line running gold and silver in the early light. Mile after mile of it, more of it than one old man and one very large woman could watch at once, no matter how hard either of them tried. 3 weeks now. 3 weeks since Warwick Doss first rode up her drive with an offer folded neat in his coat pocket, and a smile that didn't move his eyes. 3 weeks of fences cut and wells fouled, and 2 of her hands beaten so bad on the road into town. They'd quit that same week, packed their things, and ridden out before sundown, because Cobb and Reyes had made it very clear what happened to men who kept working Hollowland. She hadn't called it Hollowland. She'd never called it that. But Doss had, and once a man like Doss gave a piece of land a name, the name had a way of sticking, whether you wanted it to or not. "We'll manage," Ingrid said. "We're managing on one hand and a woman who could lift the barn off its foundation," Abel said. "Not exactly what I'd call a workforce." "You offering to quit, old man?" Abel looked at her over the wire-patched spectacles. Looked at her the way he'd looked at her since she was 22 years old and newly married and half this size, back before grief and grit had finished growing her into whatever she was now. "Never once," he said. "Not in 30 years. Not starting today." Something in Ingrid's chest did a thing it wasn't supposed to do this early in the morning. She stood up before it could do it again. "Town today," she said. "Need supplies before the week's out. You want me to come? You want to fall off the wagon halfway there because you can't see the road? I see the road fine. You see the general shape of the road. Same thing." "It is not the same thing, Abel." But she was almost smiling again, and this time it made it all the way. Rimrock Hollow wasn't much of a town, not in the summer of 1883, with the drought settled over the whole county like it had every intention of staying. One main street, packed dirt, gone to dust by August. A scattering of buildings that had been slapped up fast and stubborn. 20 years back, when somebody decided cattle needed a railhead within reach, and this was as good a spot as any. There was a church, a schoolhouse, a bank that mostly handled loans nobody could pay back, a saloon that did brisker business than all three combined. And there was the way people looked at Ingrid Voss when she rode in. She'd stopped noticing it, mostly. Or she told herself she had, which wasn't quite the same thing, but it was close enough to get through a Tuesday. Because it started the second her wagon crossed the town line, heads turning, conversations dying mid-word. Children, not that there were many left in Rimrock Hollow this dry season. Most families having pulled up stakes, the water stokes when the water started running thin, but ones that were left, they stopped and stared, with the kind of open, unashamed wonder that only children ever managed before their mothers grabbed their hands and pulled them along, murmuring things Ingrid wasn't meant to hear. She heard them anyway. She always heard them. Giantess. That was the polite one. She'd take giantess on a good day. There were worse ones. She didn't think about the worse ones if she could help it. "Morning, Mrs. Voss," said the man outside the mercantile, tipping his hat, and his eyes did the thing they always did, flicked up and up again, like he was checking a barn door for how tall it needed to be built before he caught himself and looked at her face instead. To his credit, some men never made it that far. "Morning, Mr. Callahan. Fine day. Getting warm. Always does this time of year." Small talk. She was good at small talk. It was a wall you could put up fast, and it held mostly, as long as nobody pushed too hard against it. Inside the mercantile, she moved through the aisles, the way she moved through most rooms, not built for her carefully, an inch at a time, because the ceiling beams sat lower than they had any right to, and she'd cracked her skull on one enough times in twums to have learned the layout by feel. She was reaching for a sack of flour, high on the top shelf where nobody else in the county could reach it, without a ladder, when she heard the voice, Warwick Doss's voice. It came from the front of the store, easy, unhurried, the voice of a man who had never once in his life worried about whether a room would make space for him. And I told him, Rimrock Hollow's about to see more cattle move through it than it's seen in a decade. More cattle, more money, more everything. All that stands between this whole county and a real railhead spur is a few stubborn holdouts who don't see the bigger picture yet. "A few holdouts," someone repeated. Sounded like agreement. Sounded like a man who'd already decided which side of history he wanted to stand on. "One, mostly," Doss said, and there was a small laugh in it The kind of laugh that cost the person being laughed about a great deal more than it cost the person doing the laughing. But she's a persistent sort. I respect that. I do. A woman alone, holding on to 400 acres out of pure sentiment, there's something almost admirable in it. Ingrid's hand had gone very still on the flour sack. Shame it's 400 acres sitting square on the only route that makes economic sense, Doss went on. Shame, too, about that creek of hers. Best water for 20 miles this side of the county, and going to waste on grass that could be feeding half the cattle coming up from the south. She'll come around, the other man said. She will, Doss agreed. One way or another, gentlemen. Everybody comes around. It's just a question of how much they want to lose before they do. Ingrid set the flour down. Slowly. Because if she'd set it down the way she wanted to, there'd have been a hole in the mercantile floor and a much larger conversation to have about who was going to pay for it. She walked to the front of the store. The talking stopped the second they saw her. It always did. But this time it stopped a beat later than usual. A beat where Doss's went through something quick and calculating before it settled into the same smile he wore for everyone. Mrs. Voss, he said. Speak of the devil and she appears, taller than the devil himself. A joke. He wanted her to laugh at it. Wanted the men around him to laugh at it and have that laugh be a thing shared between them. A small cruelty dressed up as friendliness. So nobody had to feel bad about it after. Ingrid didn't laugh. Mr. Doss, I trust you're well. I trust you're leaving soon. Somewhere behind him, one of the men made a sound like he was trying very hard not to laugh at something that wasn't meant to be funny. And Doss's smile thinned by exactly 1 degree. You've got a sharp tongue on you, he said. I've got a busy day, Ingrid said, which I'd rather spend on my own land than standing here listening to you. Plan how you're going to take it. Nobody's talking about taking anything, Mrs. Voss. I've made you a fair offer. More than fair. You've made me an offer for a quarter of what that land's worth, and you've made my life a misery for 3 weeks running, so I'll think it's a bargain. That's a serious accusation. It's a true one. Doss's eyes did the flick then, up and up again the way most men's eyes did the first time, except Doss wasn't most men. And his flick wasn't nervous, wasn't awed. It was appraising, the way he might look at a horse he was deciding whether to buy or shoot. You know, he said, I've heard some interesting things about you, Mrs. Voss, around town. About the sort of woman who could run 400 acres alone. Who could, I'm told, lift a wagon out of a mud rut without a horse's help. People talk. They do. Question is whether the talk's true. Why don't you find out, Ingrid said. And something in the way she said it made 2 of the men behind Doss take a half step back without seeming to notice they'd done it. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered behind Warwick Doss's eyes. That wasn't quite calculation. Wasn't quite fear either. Somewhere in between. The look of a man recalculating an equation he'd thought he already had solved. Then it was gone, and the smile was back, easy as ever. 3 days, Mrs. Voss, he said. I'll have my final offer to you in 3 days' time. After that, I can't promise the number stays where it's sitting, or that everything else around your land stays quite so peaceable. Is that a threat? It's a business forecast. Sounds like a threat. Wearing a nicer coat. Doss laughed at that, actually laughed, and tipped his hat, and walked out of the mercantile with his men a-trailing after him like he was pulling them on strings nobody else could see. Ingrid stood there for a long moment, breathing. Because that was the trick of it, wasn't it? You couldn't let a man like Doss see what he'd done to your pulse. Couldn't let him know that underneath 6 foot 10 inches and hands that could crush a fence post, there was a woman doing arithmetic she didn't want to do. 3 days. 3 days in a workforce of 1 old man with bad eyes and a widow twice the size of any man in the county. And still somehow not big enough. Not big enough to be in 6 places at once. Not big enough to watch every fence, every well, every road into town. Not big enough, apparently, for grief and fear to both to fit inside her at the same time without something cracking. You all right, Mrs. Voss? The shopkeeper asked, quiet from behind the counter. Fine, Ingrid said. She was not fine. But that wasn't the sort of thing you said out loud in a mercantile, with half the town's ears still hanging in the doorway, waiting to hear how the widow giant would take the news. She paid for her flour, carried it out to the wagon herself, one sack, under each arm like they weighed nothing at all, because that, at least, was a kind of answer. Let them see it. Let them wonder what a woman built like that could do if she ever stopped being patient. Sheriff Afas Ferris was leaning against the post outside the jailhouse when she passed, the way he always seemed to be leaning against something, like standing up straight on his own 2 feet, required more commitment than he cared to spend on any given afternoon. Mrs. Voss, Sheriff, heard you had some words with Mr. Doss just now. Word travels fast in this town. Small town, not much else for it to do. Ferris pushed his hat back, scratched at a patch of stubble along his jaw, looked at her with an expression that was trying, not very successfully, to pass itself off as sympathy. You know, if you were to have any more trouble out at your place fences, wells, that sort of thing, you'd want to come see me about it, official-like. Get it on the record. I have come to see you about it. Twice. Have you now? You know I have. You wrote it down yourself. Both times. Well, Ferris scratched his jaw again. These things take time to look into properly. Can't go accusing a man of Mr. Doss's standing without solid proof. Wouldn't be right. Wouldn't hold up even if I did. 2 of my hired men were beaten, near senseless, on the Rimrock Road. Sheriff, in broad daylight. Half the town saw it happen. Half the town also didn't see who did it, is my understanding. Dust in the air. Men in hats. Hard to swear to face in those conditions. Ingrid looked at him a long moment, long enough that Ferris found something interesting to study on the toe of his own boot. You're a careful man, Sheriff. I like to think so. Careful about which men you decide need solid proof and which men you're happy to take at their word. That's not fair, Mrs. Voss. No, Ingrid agreed, climbing back up onto her wagon seat, looking down at him, now from a height that made the sheriff's badge look considerably smaller than it usually did. It isn't. I don't imagine it's going to get any fairer, either. Not around here. She didn't wait for his answer. Snapped the reins, and left him standing there in the dust, scratching at his jaw, watching her go with an expression she couldn't quite name, and didn't much care to try. The ride home took the better part of an hour, and Ingrid spent most of it not thinking about Warwick Doss, which was its own kind of impossible. The way not thinking about something only ever made you think about it more. 3 days, she turned it over and over again, because 3 days wasn't long enough to hire on new hands, not with word already halfway around the county about what happened to men who worked for her. Wasn't long enough to fix what was broken, mend what was cut, guard what needed guarding. Wasn't long enough, maybe, for anything at all, except the thought that kept snagging, the one she couldn't quite shake loose no matter how many times she tried to set it down. Doss hadn't started 3 weeks ago. Not really. The offers had started 3 weeks ago. The threats, the cut fences. But somebody had been on her land before that. She hadn't told Abel. Hadn't told anybody, because it sounded like the kind of thing that came from a mind gone soft with grief and loneliness, and she was not going to give this county one more reason to whisper about the widow up at Timberline losing her senses, along with everything else. But she'd found the marks a month back, before Doss ever rode up her drive with his folded offer and his careful smile. Boot prints out past the north fence, where no boot had any business being. Not cattle prints, not deer. Boot prints, and beside them, pressed into the soft dirt near the creek bank, the unmistakable rectangular dent of something set down and picked up again. A satchel, maybe, or a case, and a torn scrap of paper, caught on a fence post like it had blown there and gotten stuck, with lines drawn on it in a careful surveyor's hand. Not a map of the whole county, just her creek, just the bend of it, and a set of numbers beside the bend that meant nothing to her, and everything she suspected to somebody. She'd kept the scrap, folded small, in the bottom drawer of the dresser she still hadn't cleared out on Eric's side. She hadn't shown anyone, because showing someone meant saying it out loud, and saying it out loud meant admitting that whatever this was, it had started before DOS, which meant DOS might not be the whole story, which was a thought too large and too cold to sit with alone on a wagon seat under an August sun. So she pushed it down, the way she pushed down most things, and focused instead on the road home, and the fence line coming into view, and the low afternoon light turning everything the color of old brass. She didn't see the fresh cut until she was almost on top of it. South stretch, this time. Not the section Reyes had cut Tuesday. A new section. Cut clean? This morning maybe. Or last night. The wire coiled up neat on the ground the way a careful man coiled wire, when he wanted you to know it had been done on purpose and not in a hurry. Ingrid pulled the wagon up short, climbed down, walked to the fence. And there, jammed into the top of the nearest post, was a folded piece of paper. White. New. Not weathered by wind or sun, the way the old surveyor's scrap had been. She pulled it loose, unfolded it. 2 words written in a hand that wasn't Doss's careful, businessman script. Rougher. Meaner. Sell up. She stood there a long moment, fence cut. Cattle, what few she had left, drifting loose toward the south road where anybody passing through could scatter them, or steal them, or worse, sun going down. 3 days left and now 2 words nailed to a post like a wound. Somebody wanted her to keep touching. Ingrid Voss did not cry. Hadn't cried. Not really. Not the kind that came all the way out, since the second winter after she buried her babies, when she'd finally understood that crying didn't bring anybody back, it just left you tired on top of everything else you already were. But she stood at that fence a long moment, breathing, and then she folded the paper, put it in her pocket, next to the place where the old surveyor's scrap sat folded in her memory, if not in her hand, and went to find the wire. She was still mending fence when the sun dropped low enough to turn the whole sky the color of a bruise healing. Abel had come out to help, or tried to, mostly holding tools and handing them over while Ingrid did the actual work, because that was the shape their partnership had taken these past 2 years. Him steady and patient and half-blind, her strong enough for the both of them and twice as stubborn. "You gonna tell me what that note said?" Abel asked, not looking up from the tool bag. "How do you know there was a note?" "Because you've had that look on your face all afternoon. Like something bit you, and you're deciding whether it's poison." Ingrid pulled the last length of wire taut, twisted it off clean. "Told me to sell up," she said. "That all?" "That's all. Didn't say who from. Didn't need to." Abel was quiet a moment. Then, "You thinking about it? Selling?" The question sat there in the dusk between them, honest and unhurried. The kind of question only a man who'd known you 30 years had any right to ask. "No," Ingrid said, and it came out steadier than she expected, steadier than she felt. "This is Eric's land. This is where my babies are. I am not leaving 400 acres of everything I have left in this world because a man in a nice coat wants a shortcut to a railhead." "Didn't think you were," Abel said. "Just needed to hear you say it. Why?" "Because a woman can get tired, Ingrid. Even one your size. Especially one your size. Maybe, since you spend so much of your strength holding everybody else's world up along with your own." That landed somewhere soft in her chest, and she didn't have an answer for it, so she didn't try to give one. Just picked up the wire cutters and moved to the next post. They worked in silence until the light was almost gone, until the fence was whole again, or whole enough, and the cattle had been coaxed back from the south road, one stubborn animal at a time. Ingrid straightened, wiped her hands on her trousers, looked out at the darkening land, the barn a black shape against a purple sky, the rise behind it where 2 small mounds sat quiet under the first stars. She didn't stop there tonight either, but she looked. That was something. Some nights looking was as far as grief let her go, and she'd learned to be grateful for whatever distance it allowed. "Storm's coming," Abel said, nodding at the horizon, where clouds were stacking up dark and heavy in a way that didn't belong to August, not usually. But this year had stopped following its usual rules some time back. "Good," Ingrid said. "Creek could use it. Creek could use a great deal more than one storm. One storm's what we've got." They started back toward the house, and that was when Ingrid heard it, hoofbeats, single set, coming slow up the drive from the main road. Not the hurried, aggressive rhythm of Cobb and Reyes riding in to make trouble. Something else. Unhurried. Patient. The gait of a horse that had covered a great deal of ground already today and wasn't in any rush to cover the last of it wrong. She stopped walking. Put a hand out, without quite meaning to, in front of Abel, the way you'd put a hand out in front of somebody smaller in a doorway, when trouble might be coming through it. "Get inside," she said. "Ingrid, inside, Abel. Now." He went. Not fast, not with his eyes, but he went, and Ingrid turned to face the drive and reached for the shotgun she'd left, leaning by the porch step that morning because some habits you didn't break even on the days you told yourself you were being paranoid. The rider came into view against what was left of the light. One man, one horse, no hurry in either of them. He came close enough that she could make out the shape of him, not large, not small, somewhere in between, with a hat pulled low and a coat that had seen better years, and a way of sitting his horse that told her more than his face did, because his face was still shadowed, lost, and the way a man sat a horse told you plenty, if you knew how to read it. He rode like a man who'd been riding his whole life, like a man who'd been in 100 situations that could have gone bad and had learned, somewhere along the way, that hurrying rarely helped any of them. He stopped his horse 30 feet out, which was, Ingrid noted, exactly far enough to be safe from a shotgun blast, and exactly close enough to talk, without shouting. A careful distance, a calculated one. She raised the shotgun, didn't aim it, not exactly, just held it in a way that made her intentions plain. "That's far enough," she said. "Figured as much," the man said. His voice was low, unhurried, same as the horse. Wasn't planning on coming closer without an invitation. "You're not getting one, not tonight. State your business or turn around." He was quiet a moment, and in that moment Ingrid became aware the way you become aware of a held breath, that he still hadn't done the thing every other man in this county did the first time he saw her. Hadn't looked up, hadn't looked twice, hadn't let his eyes do the flick, the measuring, the surprise dressed up as politeness, or the surprise not dressed up at all. His eyes had found her face and stayed there, same as they'd have stayed on anybody's face, same as if she were any ordinary height, any ordinary size, any ordinary woman, standing on any ordinary porch, with a shotgun in her hands at dusk. It threw her off her rhythm for exactly 1 second, and she hated that it did. "Heard in town," the man said. "That timberline's short-handed. Heard a woman. Out here's holding 400 acres near about by herself, against men who don't care for the word no. You heard right. Doesn't answer my question. My business," the man said, "is that I can mend a fence line faster than most, and I know how to mind my own affairs, which I understand is a rarer talent around here than it ought to be. I'm looking for work. You're looking, unless I've been misinformed, for hands. I'm looking for hands who'll still be standing after Warwick Doss's men come calling. Last two, who worked here, didn't manage that. I heard about that too, and it didn't put you off." "No, ma'am." "Why not?" The man was quiet again, longer this time. Long enough that Ingrid's finger found its way, unhurried, to somewhere near the trigger, not committed. "Just ready, the way you got ready, around men who took too long to answer simple questions. Because I've spent a good many years," he said finally, "doing work that mattered to nobody but the man paying me. Figured it was time I did work that mattered to somebody who deserved it." It was not, Ingrid thought, the kind of answer men usually gave when they wanted a job. Men who wanted a job usually talked about wages, about board, about how many years they'd worked cattle or how strong their back was. They did not talk about deserving. "You got a name?" she asked. "Gideon Calloway. That your real one?" Another pause. Shorter this time. But there, and Ingrid noticed it the way she noticed everything now, cataloging, filing, away. Because a woman alone on 400 contested acres learned to notice small pauses the way other people learned to notice weather. "It's the one I answer to," he said. She should have sent him away. A man who wouldn't give a straight answer to a plain question wasn't a man. You handed the keys to your safety, your land, whatever was left of your future. But there was something in the way he sat that horse. Something in the stillness of him, the patience, the way his eyes had moved once. Quick and thorough. Across the yard, the barn, the tree line, the drive, the porch. You shot a gun in her hands, cataloging it all the way a man does who spent a long time needing to know a place before he trusted it, and then had settled back on her face and stayed there, not measuring her size, measuring her, the whole of her, the way you'd measure anybody. I can pay 15 a month, Ingrid said, and bored. That's the whole of what I've got, and I won't pretend it's more. Wasn't asking for more. Doss'll come at you same as he's come at every hand I've had. Might come harder, given what he wants. I've been come at before. That's supposed to reassure me? No, ma'am. Just supposed to be honest. Ingrid lowered the shotgun. Not all the way. Just enough. Barn's got a loft, she said. You can bed down there tonight. We'll see how the morning looks. Much obliged. He swung down off the horse, slow, unhurried, same as everything else about him, and led it toward the barn, without being told which direction the barn was, which struck Ingrid as either a lucky guess or one more small thing this man noticed without seeming to try. She watched him go, stood on the porch a long while after the barn door had swallowed him and his horse, both shotguns still loose in her hands, the storm clouds stacking higher and darker against a sky gone fully black now, stars burning cold and small above it all. Because something about him unsettled her. Not in the way Doss unsettled her, all cold calculation and appetite dressed up in a nice coat. Something else. Something that unsettled her, precisely because it didn't unsettle her the way she expected. Because he hadn't flinched, hadn't stared, hadn't done any of the small cruel things that came so automatically to most men that they didn't even seem to notice themselves doing them. He'd just looked at her, like she was a person a man might hire, or trust, or the thought arrived uninvited, and she pushed it away fast, the way you'd pull your hand back from a stove before you'd fully registered the heat like a person a man might, someday under some other circumstance entirely, look at twice, for reasons that had nothing to do with hiring, which was foolish, which was a foolish, dangerous thing to be thinking about a stranger who wouldn't give his real name. On a night when Warwick Doss had given her 3 days and somebody else entirely had nailed 2 words to her fence post that weren't signed at all. Ingrid went inside, bolted the door, found Abel waiting up at the table, coffee gone cold in front of him, wire-patched spectacles pushed up on his forehead the way they went when he was thinking hard about something. Well, he said, hired a hand. That easy? Nothing about this week's been easy, Abel. He get a name? Says Gideon Calloway. Says, that's the word he used. Says. Abel was quiet a moment, turning that over the way he turned over most things, slow and careful. You trust him? Ingrid thought about the way his eyes had stayed on her face, about the stillness in him, the kind that didn't come from nowhere, the kind that usually meant a man had learned it the hard way, in places she couldn't guess at yet. I don't know what I trust yet, she said. But I know we're 1 storm and 2 days from losing everything, if somebody doesn't stand with us. And he's the only somebody who's offered. That's not the same as trust. No, Ingrid agreed, moving toward the stairs toward a bed she wouldn't sleep much in tonight. Storm coming or not. It isn't. But it'll have to do. The storm broke a little after midnight. Ingrid lay awake and listened to it thunder rolling long and low across the flatland, rain finding the roof in a rhythm that had once years ago been the sound of Eric's arm around her and 2 small warm bodies tucked between them, safe from weather, safe from everything, before the world had proven that safety was a thing you only got to borrow, never keep. She didn't cry. She'd learned by now how to hold a memory like that without letting it break her open. But she lay there a long while, listening to the thinking about a stranger sleeping in her barn loft who hadn't flinched at her size, thinking about a folded scrap of paper in her dresser drawer and a note nailed to a fence post and 3 days that were now closer to 2. thinking, though she'd have denied it to anyone who asked, about the particular way a man's lion's voice sounded when he said the one I answered to like. It cost him something to say it, and meant every word anyway. Somewhere out past the barn, the horse she didn't yet fully trust made a low, settling sound in the rain. She closed her eyes. Didn't sleep. Not really. Just waited, the way she'd learned to wait for most things now. Morning came scrubbed clean. That was the thing about a Texas storm. It tore through mean and fast and left the whole world looking apologetic the next day. Grass bent, flat and glistening, air smelling like wet stone and creosote, sky so blue and so wide it seemed to be daring anyone to remember it had been black and furious 12 hours before. Ingrid came out onto the porch, expecting to find the barn roof leaking. Expecting, maybe, to find Gideon Calloway's horse gone, and the man along with it, because that was the kind of thing strangers did. Took a meal, took a dry loft for the night, and rode on before the sun was fully up. No note, no goodbye, just an empty space where a promise had briefly stood. Instead, she found him, at the well, not drawing water, working it. He had the whole housing pulled half apart, the way she'd been meaning to do herself for 2 weeks now, ever since the rope had started catching on something down in the shaft that made every pull a small fight. He had his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and his hat pushed back, and he was frowning down into the dark of the well, like it had said something insulting to him personally. "You're up early," Ingrid said, coming down the porch steps. "Well's fouled," Gideon said, without looking up. "Somebody's been down in there. Recent. There's a length of chain wedged against the housing. Tangled bad enough it's been chewing at your rope every time you draw. I know, the well's fouled. Been fouled 3 weeks. Not like this. This isn't wear. This is deliberate." He held up a length of rusted chain, dripping, ugly, clearly, not anything that belonged to a well built for pulling water. "Somebody dropped this in on purpose. Wanted your rope catching. Wanted you thinking your well was failing on its own, so you'd wear yourself down trying to fix a thing that was never broken to begin with. Just sabotage to look that way." Ingrid stood very still. "How do you know that?" "Because I've seen it done before," Gideon said, and something moved behind his eyes. Brief, gone before she could name it. "It's an old trick. Ugly one. Makes a person feel like they're losing their mind a little, fighting something they can't see. You didn't ask anybody where the well was. Didn't ask if it needed fixing. You didn't tell me not to look. That's not an answer either." Gideon set the chain down on the stone lip, wiped his hands on a rag he'd apparently thought to bring with him, which was one more small thing that told Ingrid this wasn't a man's first morning doing this kind of work. "Man picks things up," he said, "over time. Over enough years in enough places." "What kind of years?" "The kind I don't much care to talk about before breakfast." And there it was, again, that same careful door, closing soft but closing all the same door he'd shut the night before, over his name. Ingrid could have pushed, could have stood there in the cool, washed morning, and demanded he tell her exactly what kind of man knew how to spot a sabotaged well before sunrise on his first day of work. Instead, she found herself saying, "Coffee's on. Abel made it. It's terrible. I'd be obliged anyway. Don't say I didn't warn you." Abel's coffee was, if anything, worse than the day before, and Gideon drank it without a single complaint, which either meant he had remarkable manners or had, at some point in his life, drunk considerably worse coffee under considerably worse circumstances, and Ingrid found herself wondering, not for the first time that morning, which one it was. "You're not from around here," Abel said, squinting at Gideon over the rim of his cup, spectacles pushed up on his forehead the way they went when he was cataloging a person. "No, sir." "Where's around here, then?" "Around plenty of places, over the years." "That's not an answer." "Seems to be a lot of that going around this table," Gideon said, and there was the faintest curl at the corner of his mouth when he said it. Not quite a smile, more the shadow a smile might cast if it ever got the courage to show up properly. Ingrid caught herself noticing it, set her cup down harder than she meant to. "You fixed the well," she said. "What else needs fixing, since you seem to have opinions?" Gideon looked out the window, toward the fence line. toward the barn, the tree line, the long dirt road that ran out to meet the main one into Rimrock Hollow, and Ingrid watched him take it all, in the way he'd taken it, all in the night, before quick, thorough, unhurried, the look of a man building a map in his head that he intended to keep updating for as long as he stood on this land. South Fence has a weak stretch past the second gate, he said. Not cut, just old. Wires rusted through in 3 places. Gives a little more each time cattle lean on it. Wouldn't take much to push it over, on purpose or by accident. How do you know that? You haven't walked the South Fence. Walked it last night. After the rain let up some. Couldn't sleep. You walked my fence line at midnight. Seemed like a useful thing to know before trouble came looking. Which, given what you told me last night about Doss's men, seemed like a fair bet it might. Ingrid didn't have a response ready for that. Which was, she was coming to understand, becoming something of a pattern where Gideon Calloway was concerned. He does that, Abel said, to nobody in particular, sounding entirely too pleased with himself. Man doesn't say much. Just goes and does the thing nobody asked him to do yet. Is that meant to be a compliment? Gideon asked. Wasn't sure yet, Abel said, deciding as I go. They walked the property together that morning, the 3 of them, though it was mostly Ingrid and Gideon out ahead, while Abel trailed behind, at the pace his eyes allowed, calling out observations from a comfortable distance that mostly amounted to commentary nobody had asked for. It was, Ingrid would think later, the first time in 2 years she had walked her own land beside somebody, and not felt entirely, achingly alone in the doing of it. You've got good grass, Gideon said, crouching to run a hand through it near the creek bank, the gesture of a man who'd spent real years reading land, the way other men read newspapers. Good water, or it would be if the creek weren't running this low. 2 years of drought'll do that. Not just drought. He straightened, looked upstream, toward the bend, where the water curved out of sight behind a stand of cottonwoods. Something's been done here, too. Recent, by the look of the bank. Somebody's diverted a channel upstream of your property line. Small diversion. Wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. But it's pulling more water off before it ever reaches you than the drought alone accounts for. Ingrid felt something cold settle low in her stomach. You're telling me somebody's stealing my water. I'm telling you somebody wants your water bad enough to steal it quietly instead of asking for it loudly, Gideon said. Which tells you something about how much they want it. Doss. Maybe. You don't sound sure. I'm not sure of much yet, Gideon said. Only been here since sundown yesterday. But I've learned it pays to notice what a man's willing to do quiet, same as what he's willing to do loud. Loud tells you what he wants people to think of him. Quiet tells you what he actually wants. Ingrid looked at him a long moment. At the careful stillness of him, the way his eyes tracked the creek bend and then came back, unhurried, to her face, same as always, as if the difference, in their heights, were simply a fact of the landscape. Nothing more interesting than that. You talk like a man who's done a great deal of thinking about what people actually want, she said. Occupational habit. What occupation? The careful door again. She watched it start to close, except this time he paused before it shut all the way. Old one, he said. One I don't do anymore. Figured I'd let it stay in the past, where it belongs, if it's all the same to you. It's not all the same to me, Ingrid said. I've got Warwick Doss trying to run me off land my husband's buried on, and a stranger in my barn loft who reads sabotage like other men read scripture, and I'd very much like to which one of those 2 facts ought to worry me more. Gideon was quiet a moment. Fair, he said. You're owed that much at least. So I used to hunt men. For money. Bounty work, mostly, out along the Sabine and points west of it. Some marshalling here needed hands, and didn't much care whose they were. Ingrid's breath went still in her chest. You a lawman? Was, some. Wasn't, other times. Line got blurry, in that line of work. Man doing the hunting doesn't always get to choose which side of the law he's standing on when the shooting starts. Just gets to choose whether he does it clean. And you did it clean. I did it, Gideon said. And there was something old and worn in his voice now, something that made Ingrid think of a coat that had been through too many winters to ever look new again. Whether that's the same thing as clean, I've spent 8 years trying to work out and haven't landed on an answer I like yet. 8 years since I put it down. The work, I mean. Not he stopped. Started again. I don't wear a gun for money anymore, is what I'm telling you. Haven't in 8 years. Came out here same as any drifting hand, looking for honest work, because honest work was the thing I decided, 8 years back, that I wanted the rest of my life to be built out of. And now? Gideon looked at her. Really looked, the way he'd been looking at her since he first rode up the drive, straight and steady, and entirely unbothered by the 1.5 feet of height standing between his eyes and hers. Now I reckon Timberline Ranch has got itself a fence-mending hand who used to be something else, he said. And I reckon that hand intends to make sure the something else doesn't have to come back out. If he can help it. And if you can't help it? He didn't answer that one right away, and in the silence, Ingrid heard Abel's even footsteps catching up behind them, heard a meadow lark somewhere, off past the fence line, heard the low, patient sound of water still running, thin but running, through a creek bed that somebody wanted badly enough to steal from in the dark. Then I suppose we'll find out what kind of man's left underneath, Gideon said finally. Once the something else finishes doing what needs doing. They were still out past the north pasture, examining a stretch of fence Gideon wanted to reinforce before nightfall, when Abel's voice came sharp across the field, sharper than Ingrid had heard it in longer than she could remember. Riders, 2 of them, coming up the main road. Ingrid's whole body went taut. She knew, before she'd even turned to look, exactly who it would be. Cobb and Reyes came up the drive at an easy lope, not hurrying, because men like that never hurried. Hurryings suggested you thought there might be a reason, too, and Doss's men liked the world to believe they never had reason to fear anything on 400 acres held by a widow and an old man. They pulled up in the yard, didn't dismount, sat their horses the way a man sits over cattle he's already decided he owns, just hasn't collected yet. Mrs. Voss, Cobb called out, tipping his hat with a courtesy so exaggerated it curdled into insult before it finished leaving his mouth. Mr. Doss wanted us to remind you the offer's still sitting on the table. 3 days, and then it isn't. I remember the terms, Ingrid said, coming to stand in the yard. Gideon a few steps behind her, unhurried, same as ever. Don't need reminding. Just being neighborly, Ray said, grinning, and his eyes went to the fence they'd cut and the well they'd fouled and the chain they'd dropped down her shaft in the dark, and there was nothing neighborly in that grin at all. Not one thing. Awful shame, all these accidents you keep having out here. Wells going bad. Fences falling down on their own. Water running thinner every week. County's just unlucky like that this season, I suppose. Awful unlucky, Ingrid agreed. And her voice had gone flat and cold in a way that made Cobb's horse shift under him, ears flicking back, the sensing something its rider hadn't caught onto yet. That was when Gideon stepped forward. Not fast. Not dramatic. Just a man moving from one spot in a yard to another, the way he might have moved to check a fence post, except every line of him had gone quiet in a particular way, a stillness that had weight to it, that pressed against the air, the way weather's press against a barometer before a storm nobody's seen coming yet. "Who's this?" Cobb said, and there was something new in his voice. Not quite worry. Not yet. But the first cousin of it. New hand, Ingrid said. Minds the fences. Minds the well, too, seeing as somebody's taken an unneighborly interest in both. Gideon didn't say anything at first. Just looked up at Cobb, and then at Reyes, with the same unhurried attention he'd given the bend, the sabotaged well, the weak stretch of south fence. The look of a man taking inventory, filing details away for later use. "You boys ought to head back to town," he said finally. "Quiet. Almost pleasant. Tell your Mr. Doss the lady's not selling." Reyes laughed. It came out thinner than he probably intended. "That a threat, old-timer?" "No," Gideon said. "Just telling you what's true, same as I'd tell anybody. You know who you're standing next to, old-timer." Cobb tried. though there was less bite in it now than there'd been a minute back. "This here's Mrs. Voss. Woman's near 7 feet tall. Could crush your skull between two fingers if the mood struck her." "I'm aware," Gideon said. "Doesn't worry you none?" "No." "Why's that?" "Because she's never once given me a reason to be worried," Gideon said. "Which is more than I can say for the two of you, in about 4 minutes of conversation." Reyes's grin finally gave out entirely, folding into something flatter, less certain. "You're awful calm for a fence hand," he said. "I'm awful calm most days," Gideon agreed. "Doesn't mean there's nothing underneath it. Just means I don't waste the calm on men who haven't earned the trouble of losing it." Something passed between Cobb and Reyes, then, a look neither man could have explained if you'd asked them to. The particular unease of two men who'd walked into a great many fights in their lives and had learned, somewhere along the way, to recognize the specific quiet of a man who wasn't afraid of them at all, and never would be, no matter how many of them showed up in the yard. "We'll be seeing you," Cobb said, which was the kind of thing men said when they didn't have anything better to say and needed to leave with some shred of the last word intact. "I expect you will," Gideon agreed. They wheeled their horses around, rode off toward the main road at considerably less of an easy lope than they'd arrived with, and Abel, watching from the porch with his spectacles pushed up on his forehead, let out a low whistle that carried clean across the yard. "Well," he said, "never seen Reyes back off a fight that fast in the 2 years I've watched him start them." "Wasn't a fight," Gideon said, turning back toward the fence he'd been reinforcing before the interruption, unhurried like nothing at all had happened, like his pulse hadn't moved a single feet through the whole exchange. "Just a conversation that ended early." Ingrid stood in the yard a long moment, watching the dust settle where Cobb and Reyes's horses had kicked it up, watching Gideon walk back toward the north fence like the last 5 minutes hadn't happened at all. She thought about the stillness in him, the weight of it, the particular, practiced calm of a man who had, by his own admission, spent years being the kind of trouble that made other trouble think twice. And she thought, too, about the surveyor's scrap folded in her dresser drawer, and the boot prints by the creek that predated Doss's first offer by weeks, and the careful, deliberate diversion Gideon had spotted upstream that very morning, a diversion that had been dug, by the look of the bank, long before Warwick Doss ever rode up her drive, with his folded offer and his patient smile. Somebody had been planning this before Doss arrived at all. She didn't know yet who, didn't know yet why. But standing in that yard, watching a stranger with a gunslinger's stillness walk back toward her fence line, like he'd done nothing more remarkable than swat a fly, Ingrid Voss understood, with a clarity that settled cold and certain in her chest, that whatever was coming for Timberline Ranch had roots that ran a great deal deeper than one cattleman's greed. And she had a feeling one she couldn't yet explain, one that sat uneasy alongside the feeling stirring in her, the one she wasn't ready to look at directly, the one that had to do with quiet eyes that never once flicked upward and stayed there, that Gideon Calloway was going to turn out to be tangled up in all of it, one way or another. She just didn't yet know how deep the tangle ran. She didn't settle that afternoon. Couldn't. Went through the motions of chores instead. Mended what could be mended. Fed what needed feeding. Because that was the trick of a working ranch, wasn't it? The animals didn't care what kind of day you were having, didn't care that a cattleman had given you 3 days, and a stranger's past had just turned out to run 52 men deep. They just wanted their feed. On time. Same as always. So she fed them. On time. Same as always. Except her mind wouldn't while her hands worked. Kept circling back to the diverted creek, to the chain in the well, to Cobb's grin, thin as paper, and the particular way it had gone thinner still when Gideon stepped forward, to the word 52, which she hadn't heard yet, that came later that night on the porch, but some animal part of her had already sensed it coming, the way you sense weather before the sky commits to anything, which was foolish. Which was the kind of thinking Abel would have called borrowing trouble on credit it hadn't earned yet. Except it didn't feel foolish. It felt like arithmetic. A hired hand who reads sabotage before sunrise, who walked a fence line at midnight without being asked, who didn't flinch, didn't stare, didn't do a single one of the small, cruel things that came so natural to everyone else in this county that they'd stopped noticing themselves doing it, and who also, apparently, made Cobb and Reyes back off a confrontation faster than she'd ever seen either man back off anything. That wasn't ordinary. Ordinary men didn't do that. So what was he? She caught herself mid-thought, the way she'd been catching herself all day, and made herself stop. Made herself finish latching the feed bin instead of standing there in the yard building a whole man out of guesses and half-answers, and the particular quiet weight of somebody's stillness, until she couldn't stop. Not really. Not all the way. Because underneath the arithmetic what is he and what does he want, and should I be afraid of the answer? There was a smaller, quieter question she liked considerably less, which was, why did none of it frighten her the way it should? She didn't have an answer for that one. Not yet. Filed it away instead, next to the surveyor's scrap and the boot prints and the diverted creek, in the same crowded drawer of her mind, where she kept everything she wasn't ready to look at head-on. There'd be time for it later, she told herself. There had to be. 2 days left before Doss's deadline, and 100 smaller things demanding her attention before sundown, and she could not, have time today to sit with a feeling that large. Except feelings that large had a way of not waiting for a convenient hour. She learned that again, that night, on the porch, lamp burning low, when a man with 52 ghosts behind his eyes handed her back a scrap of folded paper and looked at her like the weight of the whole world sitting between them was something he intended to help her carry, whether she'd asked him to or not. That night, after Abel had gone up to bed, and the house had settled into the creaking quiet of a place built to hold more people than it currently held, Ingrid sat on the porch steps with a lamp turned low beside her and found Gideon there already, cleaning a revolver by lamplight with the unhurried care of a man performing a ritual he'd performed 10,000 times before. It was an old Colt, well used, well cared for, the way a man keeps a thing close for reasons that have nothing to do with sentiment. You're not just a drifter, Ingrid said, sitting down beside him, close enough to talk, far enough to cap her own counsel if this turned out to be a night for regretting things. No, Gideon admitted. I'm not. Going to tell me the rest of it? Or just enough to keep me from sending you off at first light? He turned the cylinder over in the lamplight, checking each chamber the way a man checks something he's learned, the hard way, not to trust without checking. 52, he said finally. 52 what? Men. 52 men I put in the ground, doing that work. Some of them deserved it, more than others. All of them are just as dead, regardless of which. Ingrid sat very still. 52. The number landed somewhere behind her ribs and stayed there, ringing, the way a struck bell keeps ringing, long after the hand that struck it has gone quiet. 52. Not a number, a man said lightly. Not a number without a face attached to every single one of them, waiting somewhere behind his eyes for a moment just like this one. She thought of Eric. Couldn't help it. Thought of how fast a whole life folded down into a number carved on a stone, or not even carved, just counted, filed, recited on a porch at night like weather. Except it wasn't weather. It was 52 mothers who'd buried sons. 52 wives, maybe somewhere, doing exactly what she'd done 2 winters, back standing over dirt that hadn't settled, wondering how a body kept breathing after the thing it loved most had stopped. And she was sitting beside the man who'd put 100 of them in the ground. She should have been afraid. Some sensible, careful part of her, the part that had kept her upright and solvent through 2 years, nobody would have blamed her for not surviving. That part was, in fact, afraid, was already counting the distance to the shotgun, was already doing the arithmetic it always did around men whose stillness ran this deep. Except the fear didn't win. It sat there, present, accounted for, and something else sat beside it. Something that had noticed the weight in his voice on that number, same as a man carries a debt 8 years running, and still doesn't consider it settled. Why'd you stop? Because I got tired, Gideon said, of being the reason women end up widows, same as you. Tired of watching what that kind of life does to the inside of a person, even when the killing's justified 6 ways from Sunday. Hung it up 8 years back. Been drifting since, doing honest work where I could find it. Minding fences instead of minding graves. And now Doss shows up. And men are cutting my fences, and dropping chains in my well, and diverting my creek water in the dark, and leaving notes that don't sign their names. Now, Gideon agreed. I reckon I've got one more fight left in me, whether I asked for it or not. Because a man ought to stand for something before he's done standing at all. And this seems as good a thing to stand for as any I've come across in a long while. Ingrid looked out at the dark fields, at the fence lines he'd already started mending, the well he'd already fixed, the small, contested piece of the world she'd fought 2 years to keep whole. Thought about Warwick Doss's smile, and the 2 words nailed to a fence post, and a surveyor's scrap folded away in a drawer that held, still, half of a dead man's clothes she couldn't bring herself to give away. Thought, too, though she'd never have said it out loud, about how it felt to sit beside a man who looked at her face, and only her face, in lamplight, at the end of a long day, like there was nowhere else worth looking. She got up before she could talk herself out of it, went inside, climbed the stairs, quiet past Abel's door, past the room she still hadn't fully cleared, to the dresser on Eric's side, where a small bottom drawer held a folded square of paper she hadn't shown a living soul. She brought it back out to the porch, held it a moment before she handed it over. Found this a month back, she said. Past the north fence before Doss ever rode up my drive. Boot prints, too, that didn't belong to cattle nor deer, nor any man who works this land. Didn't tell anybody. Didn't want the county deciding grief had finally cracked me clean through. Gideon unfolded it, held it up toward the lamp. It was a surveyor's hand, careful and precise, a sketch of the creek's bend, and a string of numbers beside it that meant nothing to Ingrid, and by the sudden stillness that came over him, meant something considerable to Gideon. You recognize the hand, Ingrid said. It wasn't a question. Can't say for certain, Gideon said, and his voice had gone quieter than she'd heard it yet, careful in a new way, a way that worried her more than any note nailed to any fence post had managed to. But I've marks made like this before. Years back, different territory, different names on the deeds. Same careful little numbers, same particular slant to the hand. What's it mean? Means somebody was pricing this creek before Doss ever said a word to you about a railhead, Gideon said. Means whoever wanted your water first wasn't thinking about cattle at all. Then what were they thinking about? Gideon folded the paper back along its old creases, handed it to her, careful, like it weighed a great deal more than a scrap of paper had any right to. I don't know yet, he said, but I intend to find out. And I'd be obliged, Mrs. Voss, if you kept this between the two of us a while longer, until I know what I'm looking at. That a request or a warning? Bit of both, I expect. Ingrid folded the paper into her own pocket, this time, close against her, and looked at him a long moment in the low lamplight. This quiet, careful 52 ghost of a man who'd ridden up her drive with no name he'd fully give, and no past he'd fully own, and who had just gone very still over a scrap of paper that had unsettled her for a month and unsettled him, apparently, in about 4 seconds flat. 3 days, she said. Well, 2 now. 2 days before Doss's deadline runs out, and I still don't know what he does when it does. And now I don't know what this is, either, or how deep it runs, or how much of it you already know and aren't saying. Then I reckon, Gideon said, setting the reassembled Colt down beside him, quiet and ready in the dark, we'd best be ready before either one of them finds us short. Somewhere out past the barn, an owl called once and went silent. The lamp burned low between them. And Ingrid Voss, who had spent 2 years learning to carry the whole weight of Timberline Ranch on shoulders built, it seemed for exactly that purpose, sat in the dark beside a man with 52 ghosts behind his eyes, and a folded scrap of paper that had gone still and cold in her pocket, and found, for the first time since she'd buried her husband on the rise behind the barn, that the weight felt for one unguarded hour, on one unremarkable night, like something she might not have to carry entirely alone. She didn't know yet what that feeling was going to cost either one of them. She didn't know yet how deep the tangle ran between a dead surveyor's numbers and a live cattleman's threats, and a stranger's carefully unfinished sentences. She only knew, watching the lamp gutter low and the stars wheel slow overhead, that whatever was coming for Timberline Ranch, it was coming for both of them now. Together, whether the county liked the shape of that or not. Whether either one of them was ready for it or not. 2 days came and went the way most deadlines do. Quiet at first, then not, because Warwick Doss didn't ride up the drive with 6 armed men behind him. Didn't send Cobb and Reyes with fresh threats nailed to fresh posts. Instead, he did something worse, something slower, something that didn't leave a mark you could point to, only a hollowing out you felt in your chest at 3 in the morning when the numbers wouldn't stop circling. He went to the bank. Ingrid found out from the teller, a nervous young man named Combs, who kept his eyes fixed somewhere near her collarbone, the whole conversation. Like looking any higher required a courage he hadn't packed that morning. "Note's been called, Mrs. Voss," he said. "The one on your north acreage. Bank wants it settled. 90 days. That note's not due for another year. Terms can change, ma'am." Says so right there in the fine print. Mr. Harmon signed off on it. Personal. Mr. Harmon, who sits on the town council with Warwick Doss. "I wouldn't know anything about that." "No," Ingrid said. "I don't suppose you would." She stood there a moment longer than she needed to, in that narrow bank lobby, with its ticking clock and its smell of ink and dust, and felt something rise in her chest that she recognized distantly as panic trying to find a door. 90 days, which sounded like plenty, said out loud in a quiet room. Except it wasn't plenty, wasn't close to plenty, not with a herd half its usual size and a drought eating the grass out from under what was left of it. Because 90 days meant selling stock at whatever price she could get, fast, desperate, the way desperate sellers always got robbed blind by men who could smell desperation from 3-count counties off, which meant less money than the land was worth, which meant she caught herself, made herself breathe, made herself walk, steady, unhurried, out through that narrow door, built for men half her size, because young Combs didn't need to watch a widow twice his height come apart at his teller's window, and neither did the 2 ranch wives waiting behind her, with their own small deposits clutched in gloved hands. She walked out of that bank with her jaw set tight enough to ache, and the whole ride home she turned the number over. 90 days. 90 days to pay off a debt that wasn't supposed to come due for a year, or lose the north acreage outright, which happened to be the acreage that ran clean down to the creek, which wasn't a coincidence, which was never going to be a coincidence, not with a man like Doss deciding which levers to pull, because that was the thing about him she was only now starting to understand. He didn't need to burn your barn or beat your hands bloody if he could just squeeze the money out from under you instead. Quieter, cleaner, and a great deal harder to stand against with a shotgun. Gideon was waiting on the porch when she got back, and something in her face must have told him plenty, because he didn't ask how her morning had gone. Just waited. Patient, the way he was patient about most things. "Bank called my note," she said, climbing down from the wagon. 90 days on the north acreage, or they take it. The acreage that runs to the creek. That acreage. "That's not a bank decision," Gideon said. "That's Doss wearing a banker's coat. I know it. You going to be able to pay it?" Ingrid didn't answer right away. Because the honest answer was no, not in 90 days. Not with 2 hired hands run off and a herd half its usual size and a drought that had already cost her more than she could afford to keep quiet about. Except saying that out loud made it real in a way she wasn't ready for yet. So she said, "I'll manage," which was the same thing she'd been saying for 2 years running. And Gideon looked at her, the way he'd started looking at her lately. Not doubting exactly, just seeing straight through the manage to whatever sat underneath it. "You don't have to manage alone," he said. "I've been managing alone a long while, Mr. Calloway. I noticed. Doesn't mean I've enjoyed it. Something shifted in his face at that. Small, quick, gone before she could name it properly. Except she thought, for just a second, it might have been the shadow of something like hope. Abel came out onto the porch then, wire-patched spectacles pushed up on his forehead, carrying 2 mugs of coffee that had gone, mercifully, slightly less terrible than usual. Bad news travels fast in this house, he said, handing a mug to Ingrid and one, after a moment's consideration, to Gideon as well. Heard about the note from the boy who delivers feed. Heard about it before you'd even finished driving through the gate. Small towns, Ingrid said. Small, mean, and entirely too interested in other people's arithmetic, Abel agreed. What's the plan? Cattle drive in 6 weeks, Gideon said. Sell what stock we can spare to a buyer. Outside the county. Outside Doss's reach. And in the meantime? In the meantime, Ingrid said, we work. Same as always. Only harder. Abel looked at her a long moment over the particular look he gave Smug, the particular look he gave her when he was to say the thing sitting behind his eyes, or let it pass. You know, he said finally, your husband used to say something, back when things got tight. Said hard years don't break a ranch. Said it's the years right after the hard years that break it, when everybody's too tired to notice the next thing coming. Comforting Abel, truly, wasn't meant to comfort, meant to warn. He took a slow sip of coffee, just saying keep your eyes open, even when you're tired, especially then. Ingrid didn't answer that, just looked out at the land, gone gold and long in the last of the daylight, and felt the weight of 90 days settle a little heavier across her shoulders. Sheriff Amos Ferris had a habit, Ingrid learned that week, of taking his lunch at the same table in the back corner of the boarding house dining room, every single day, same hour, like a man who valued routine more than he valued being hard to find. She sat down across from him without asking. Mrs. Voss, he set his fork down. This a social call? I want to know how much Doss pays you. Excuse me? You heard me fine, Sheriff. I want a number. Ferris's face did several things, in quick successions, surprise, then insult, then something that looked, underneath it all, uncomfortably close to fear. That's a serious accusation to be throwing around a public dining room. I've got serious trouble happening on my land. Seemed only fair the accusations kept pace. I don't take money from Warwick Doss. Then explain to me, Ingrid said, why the bank called a note that wasn't due on the exact acreage Doss wants most, 3 days after he stood in my yard and gave me 3 days to fold. Explain the coincidence. I'll wait. Ferris didn't have an explanation, or he had one, and it wasn't one he cared to say out loud in a dining room with half the boarding house listening. You should be careful, Mrs. Voss, he said instead. Man in my position, accused unfair, has ways of making a widow's life a great deal harder than it already is. Is that a threat, Sheriff? It's a friendly warning. Funny, Ingrid said, standing, unfolding to her full height, in a way that made 2 other diners down their forks entirely. Everybody around here seems to have a friendly warning for me lately. Not one of them's actually been friendly. She left him sitting there, lunch going cold, and didn't look back to see his face. Didn't need to. She already knew what she'd find. Except the walk back to her wagon gave her time to think, which wasn't always a mercy. Because underneath the anger, underneath the satisfaction of watching Ferris's face go pale in front of half the boarding house, there was a colder thought waiting. If the sheriff was bought, then the law itself was bought, which meant the next time trouble came, riding up her drive, there'd be no badge worth trusting to stand between her and it, which meant whatever came next, she and Abel and one quiet stranger with 52 ghosts behind his eyes were going to have to be enough all on their own, because nobody wearing a star in this county was coming to help. She climbed up onto the wagon seat, sat there a moment before taking the reins, until a voice behind her made her go still. Mrs. Voss. She turned, found the boarding house, cook standing in the alley doorway, a heavy-set woman named Marta who'd never said more than good morning to Ingrid in 3 years of passing each other on the street. Heard what you said in there, Marta said, glancing back toward the dining room, voice low. Wasn't wrong. What you accused him of. Seen the sheriff meet with one of Doss's men out back of the jailhouse more than once. Money changing hands. Didn't think it was business to say so. Why are you saying so now? Marta was quiet a moment, twisting her apron in both hands. Because my sister married a rancher out past Willow Creek, she said. And that creek's run dry twice this summer already. And if what folks are starting to whisper about your land is true about water under it, real water, the kind that doesn't quit, then this isn't just your fight anymore. Mrs. Voss, it's half the county's, whether they've worked out the shape of it yet or not. She disappeared back inside before Ingrid could ask another question, leaving her sitting in the wagon with one more piece of a puzzle that kept growing larger every time she looked at it directly. The rancher's name was Hollis Pruitt, and he arrived at Timberline 3 mornings later, on a horse so lathered it had clearly covered the distance from Willow Creek at something close to a dead run. Ingrid met him in the yard, Abel a step behind her, with the shotgun he pretended he could still aim reliably. Mrs. Voss, Pruitt swung down, hat already off, hands twisting the brim, the way nervous men's hands always seem to want to twist something. Sorry to come uninvited. Wouldn't have, except words traveling faster than sense these days, and I needed to hear it from you directly. Hear what? That your creek's sitting over the last real water this county's got left. Ingrid felt her jaw tighten. Who told you that? Doesn't matter who told me. Matters whether it's true. Pruitt's eyes were red-rimmed, exhausted. A man who'd clearly been awake, counting his own losses long before he ever climbed onto that lathered horse. My creek's been dry 6 weeks now. Cattle dying faster than I can drive them to what water is left. If there's a spring under your land that doesn't quit, Mrs. Voss, that's not just your good fortune anymore. That's the difference between half this county surviving the next 2 years or not. I'm not selling to, if that's what you're here to ask. Wasn't going to ask that. Pruitt shook his head, hard, like the very suggestion offended him. Was going to ask something else entirely. Whether if it comes down to a fight, and folks are saying it's coming down to exactly that, whether Timberline's going to have more than one gun standing behind it when Doss finally shows his whole hand. Ingrid looked at him a long moment, at the exhaustion in his face, the genuine fear underneath it. Nothing like the careful calculation she'd grown so used to reading in Doss's smile. You offering to stand with me, Mr. Pruitt? I'm offering, he said, to stop, pretending this is only your problem, when the truth's plain enough that it never was. There's 4 other outfits along Willow Creek, thinking the same thing I am, this very morning. Don't know yet what that adds up to. But it's more than nothing. He rode out within the hour, promising to send word once he'd spoken to the others, and Ingrid stood in the yard a long while after his dust had settled, turning the offer over, because it changed the shape of things. Because Doss wasn't just squeezing one stubborn widow anymore. He was squeezing a whole county's future, and word of that had a way of turning quiet fear into something with teeth. Once enough desperate men found each other and compared notes. Which meant, maybe, for the first time since Warwick Doss first rode up her drive with his folded offer and his patient smile, Ingrid wasn't going to be facing him entirely alone, no matter what happened to the fragile, unfinished thing sitting between her and Gideon. She found some comfort in that. Not enough to erase the argument still waiting to happen that night. Once she found the letter tucked inside Eric's old ledger book, the letter that would finally give a name to the coincidence she couldn't stop turning over, but enough to get her through the rest of the afternoon, standing upright. That evening, Gideon found her out past the barn, splitting wood with a fury that had less to do with firewood, and everything to do with a corrupt sheriff, and a called note, and a deadline she didn't know how to meet. He didn't say anything at first, just picked up a log, set it on the block across from her. You want to talk about it, he said, or you want to keep taking it out on perfectly innocent firewood. Firewood's not going to file a complaint. No, but you'll run out of it before you run out of anger. And then where'll we be come winter? Despite herself, Ingrid almost laughed. Almost. Doss called my note. Ferris is bought and paid for, and I've got 90 days to come up with money I don't have. or lose the piece of land that happens to run straight to my creek. Then we get you the money. How? Same way you get anything hard done. One piece at a time. He hefted the axe, testing its weight, and there was something almost domestic in the motion, something that made Ingrid's chest do a thing she wasn't prepared to examine too closely. Cattle drives coming through in 6 weeks. You sell what stock you can spare, at a fair price, to a buyer who isn't Doss. There isn't a buyer in this county who isn't Doss, one way or another. Then we find one outside the county. That easy. Nothing's that easy, Gideon said. But it's a start, and starts are worth more than most people give them credit for. He swung the axe, split the log clean in one stroke, and there was a kind of quiet competence in it that Ingrid had noticed before, and kept noticing, against her better judgment, more than she meant to. You want to try, he said, holding the axe out to her, handle first. I know how to split wood, Mr. Calloway. I know you do. I've seen you do it. Angry, mostly, which works fine on firewood but wastes about half your strength doing it. Wanted to show you something different. Ingrid took the axe, waited. Don't swing from the shoulders, he said. You've got more power than that. You're not using half of it, same as most folks your size never learn to, because the world spends so much time telling them to make themselves smaller that they forget how to take up the space they were given. Swing from the hip. Let the weight do the work. You won't need anger for it at all. She set a log on the block, swung the way he said. The log split clean, and the halves flew wider and further than anything she'd managed all evening. And something about the ease of it, the sheer, uncomplicated ease of doing a hard thing well, without rage driving. It settled something in her chest that had been unsettled for longer than she wanted to admit. There it is, Gideon said. Quiet. There what is? That look. Same one you had the day I rode up your drive and you weren't sure whether to shoot me or hire me. Like you just remembered something about yourself you'd forgotten you were allowed to have. Ingrid looked at him a long moment, axe still loose in her hand, evening light going gold and long across the yard. You say things like that, she said, and I don't know what to do with them. Don't have to do anything with them, Gideon said. Just wanted you to hear it. Figured you don't hear it near enough. They kept working, side by side, the pile of split wood growing steady between them, and for a while neither one of them said anything at all. And it was, Ingrid thought, a comfortable kind of quiet. The rare kind. The kind that didn't need filling. Can I ask you something? She said finally. Ask. All those years you spent hunting men. 52 of them, you said. Did anybody ever once look at you the way this whole county looks at me? Gideon set down his axe, considered the question with the same careful weight he gave most things. Some did, he said. Fear does strange things to how a person sees another person, makes some men smaller in your eyes, makes others larger than they've got any right to be. I got both, depending on the town, depending on the year. Which was worse? The larger, he said, without hesitation. Man looks at you like you're more monster than person. It's easier, in a way, to be angry at him for it. But a man looks at you like you're bigger than human, like you're not quite real, not quite someone who bleeds or tires, or wants an ordinary supper. At the end of an ordinary day, that's a lonelier thing to carry. Harder to be angry at. Just makes you tired, instead. Ingrid stood very still, log forgotten in her hand. That's it exactly, she said. Quiet. That's exactly it. Figured it might be. Gideon picked his axe back up. You're not a monster, Ingrid. And you're not some travel curiosity, either, whatever this county's decided about you over the years. You're just a woman who happens to be built on a larger scale than most, doing the same hard work as anybody, carrying the same grief as anybody, wanting the same ordinary supper at the end of the same ordinary day. Only difference is, you've had to do it while half-oft stared at you, like you were something out of a dime novel. And you don't. No, Gideon said, simple, unhurried, like it cost him nothing at all to say, I don't. Ingrid turned back to the woodpile before he could see what that admission had done to her face. Split another log, clean, the way he'd shown her, weight doing the work instead of anger, and found to her own quiet surprise that her eyes had gone unexpectedly warm at the corners. She blinked it back before it could become anything more embarrassing than that. Because a widow, twice the size of any man in the county, did not cry over firewood, and a fence hand's kind words, however true they happened to be. That was not a thing she was prepared to explain to Abel over breakfast. Except some part of her, quiet and unguarded, thought that maybe, someday soon, she might not mind explaining it after all. It was 3 days later, out past the north fence, that they found the old spring. Gideon had been walking the property line at dawn. Again, a habit Ingrid had stopped questioning, and he came back to the house moving faster than she'd ever seen him move, which was still by most men's standards, no particular hurry at all, except she'd learned by now to read the difference. "You need to see this," he said. He led her out past the fence, past the creek bend, to a low limestone shelf half hidden under scrub brush that Ingrid had walked past 1,000 times, without once really looking at it. "There's water under this whole shelf," Gideon said. "Not creek water, deeper. An old spring, capped off some time back. By the look of the stonework, somebody built this cap decades ago, and it's been sitting quiet under the brush ever since. Capped by who? Don't know yet, but this explains a great deal." He crouched, ran a hand along the old stonework, careful, the way he touched most things. "Your creek's been running low 2 years straight, same as every creek in this county, except your creek keeps a baseline flow that no other creek for 20 miles manages, drought or no drought. I noticed it my first week here and couldn't work out why. This is why you're not just sitting on good grass in a seasonal creek, Ingrid. You're sitting on the only reliable water source left in the whole county, once the surface creeks finish drying up for good." Ingrid stood very still, because that changed everything. Because that wasn't about a cattle route anymore, wasn't about a shortcut to a railhead spur, wasn't even really about her 400 acres at all. Which meant Doss wasn't just greedy. Which meant every rancher for 20 miles was going to be drinking from whatever well Doss controlled. Inside of 2 more dry years, if he got his hands on this shelf, and Eric had known. She was certain of it suddenly, standing there, some half-buried memory surfacing. Eric out here years back, with a shovel and a strange, private satisfaction on his face, telling her he'd found something worth keeping quiet about, something that would matter someday. Though I'd never said what, and she'd never pressed, because there always seemed to be more time to ask later. There hadn't been more time. There never was, it turned out, not for the things that mattered most. "He knew," she said, quiet. "Eric knew about this. Must have. And never told me the whole of it." She sat down on the limestone shelf itself, right there in the brush, careless of her skirts, and put her head in her hands for a moment, because the memory had opened a door she hadn't been ready for. Standing out here in the ordinary morning light, with dew still clinging to the grass. "There's more," she said, not looking up. "Eric used to walk out this way alone some evenings, never said why. I used to tease him about it, told him a rancher wandering his own back acreage. For no reason was a rancher with too much time on his hands. He'd just laugh. Say a man's allowed a few secrets even from his wife. I never pushed. Thought it was nothing. Thought it was just a man needing his own quiet corner of the world, same as anybody does." "Might have been exactly that," Gideon said, gentle. "A man can love a piece of ground for its own sake, same as for what it hides. Might have been both." "Might have been both," he agreed. Ingrid stood, brushed the dust from her skirts, looked down at the old stonework, with new eyes no longer just weathered rock, half swallowed by scrub brush, but something her husband had known, had guarded, had maybe died protecting, though the shape of that possibility was still too raw and too large to hold steady in her mind for more than a few seconds, at a stretch. "You think that's what happened," she said, "to Eric, that somebody found out what he was guarding?" Gideon didn't answer right away, and in the pause, Ingrid felt something cold move through her, quick, unwelcome. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I think it's worth finding out. A secret like this gets a person killed in the wrong company before somebody decides you're one more loose end standing between them and this spring." She found the letter that same evening, and she wasn't even looking for it. She'd gone up to the bedroom to fetch a shawl against the evening chill, and something about the spring, about Eric's private walks out past the north fence, had pulled her toward the old ledger book he'd kept his ranch accounts in, the one she hadn't opened since the week after the funeral, when going through numbers had felt marginally more bearable than going through memories. The ledger fell open to a page near the back. Not accounts, a letter, folded small, tucked between the pages like a man hiding something even from his own careful bookkeeping. It wasn't signed. But the hand was Eric's, unmistakable, and the date sat at the top, 6 months before the fire. If anything should happen to me, it read, know that the spring past the north fence is worth more than this whole once was more than this from Sabine country have already asked after it more than once, offering money I wouldn't take, and then, when that failed, asking questions I liked considerably less. A man named Rourke sent his people around in the spring, told them no again. Pray I never have to tell them a third time. Ingrid sat down hard on the edge of the bed, letter shaking slightly in her hand, because there it was. Not proof, not exactly a name in a dead man's private, letter unsigned, unwitnessed, the kind of thing a careful lawyer would call insufficient. But it was enough. Enough to turn a cold, formless suspicion into something with a shape and a name attached to it. Rourke. The same name Gideon had spoken not an hour past supper, careful and reluctant, like a man setting down something he'd hoped never to have to lift again. She read it twice more, before she trusted her hands enough to fold it back along its old creases, until she made herself stop reading it a fourth time, made herself stand, made herself walk back downstairs, letter clutched tight, because there was a conversation waiting that couldn't wait 1 hour longer, whatever it cost either one of them to have it. That night, the argument came, sudden and sharp, the way storms came in August, clear sky 1 hour, thunderheads stacked black the next. It started this time, with a letter set down on the supper table between them, unfolded, Eric's unsigned hand facing up toward the lamplight. Gideon read it slow, read it twice, and something moved through his face while he did not surprise exactly, Ingrid thought, watching him closely. Something closer to dread confirmed. You know this name, she said. Not a question. I told you I did. Hours ago. You told me you'd crossed paths with him. You didn't tell me he'd sent men to threaten my husband 6 months before he died. Because I didn't know that, Gideon said, and his voice had gone tight now, careful in a new way. I swear to you, Ingrid, I didn't know Rourke's people had ever come near this land before Doss showed up with his own offer. If I'd known, I'd have told you the very first night, whatever it cost me. Because that was the thing sitting hardest in her chest now, not just the name, but the shape of the coincidence around it. Eric's secret, the spring, the old stonework built by hands she'd never know, and a stranger sitting across her supper table who'd once, by his own account, ridden in the same rough circles as the very man her husband's unsigned letter named as a threat, which meant either it was all coincidence, and she'd stopped believing much in coincidence 2 years and 1 burned barn ago, or it wasn't. And if it wasn't, then everything she'd let herself feel this past month, every unguarded hour on that porch, every moment her chest had done that traitorous warm thing around a man with 52 ghosts behind his eyes, all of it needed looking at again, harder, colder, before she let it go 1 inch further. Tell me everything you remember about him, she said. Rourke, every name that worked under him, every job you did for him that touched land or water or a family that wouldn't sell. Ingrid, everything, Gideon. Doss was young too. Back then, Gideon said, slow, careful, laying the pieces down one at a time like a man diffusing something. Rourke's junior partner, or near enough. I met him twice, maybe 3 times, years back. Wouldn't have remembered his face at all if he hadn't shown up in your yard with that same particular smile. Ingrid's whole body went cold. You knew him before, and you let me stand in my own yard 3 weeks ago and trade words with him like he was a stranger to you. Barely knew him, And not in any way that matters, you were going to say. Her voice had gone sharp now, sharper than she meant it to, except she couldn't seem to stop it. Except it does matter, Gideon. Because a man came up my drive asking for work 3 weeks ago, and never once mentioned he'd already crossed paths with the very man trying to take everything I have left. It was years ago. A different life. Was it a different life the day my husband died, in a fire nobody could explain, on land that turns out to be sitting over the one thing worth killing for in this whole county? Huh? Because that timing's awful close for something you're calling a coincidence. I'm not calling it anything, Gideon said. And there was something raw in his voice now, something that hadn't been there before. I don't know if it connects. I've turned it over every way I know how, and I can't make the pieces sit clean. But I'm not going to lie to you and pretend certainty I don't have, just to make this easier for either one of us, easier. Ingrid laughed, short and humorless. None of this has been easy, Gideon. Not one day of it. No, he agreed. Quiet. It hasn't. They stood there a long moment, the distance between them feeling, for the first time since he'd ridden up her drive, like more than 1.5 feet of height, like something wider, something that might not close back up on its own. Say something, Ingrid said, when the silence stretched too long to bear. Anything. Because right now, all I've got is a dead husband, a false deadline, a bought sheriff, and a hired hand who admits he's crossed paths with the man trying to bury me, and not one single thing you've said tonight tells me whether I ought to be more afraid of Doss out there, or of you standing right here. You've never had reason to fear me, Gideon said, low, and something in his voice cracked just slightly around the edges. Not one day since I rode up this drive. Whatever I was, whoever I worked for, all of that ended 8 years back. Same as I told you the first night. I can't undo having crossed paths with Rourke's outfit. Can't undo the years I spent not asking questions I should have asked. All I can do is tell you the truth as I understand it, and keep telling it, even when the truth's ugly and unfinished, and doesn't give either one of us the clean answer we're both wanting. Ingrid pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes for a moment, because she was so tired. Because grief and fear and this strange, new, unwanted feeling for a man with 52 ghosts behind his eyes had all been sitting together in her chest for weeks now, crowded and combustible, and tonight, apparently, was the night they'd finally decided to catch fire all at once. I need you to find out, she said finally, hand dropping back to her side. Whatever you can. About Rourke. About Doss. About whether the past you're carrying and the trouble sitting on my doorstep are the same trouble wearing 2 different coats. I intend to. And if they are the same trouble? Gideon looked at her, steady, the way he'd looked at her since the first night, straight and unflinching, and entirely unbothered by anything except the answer he owed her. Then I'll stand here anyway, he said. Same as I already promised. Whatever it costs me to find out. It wasn't forgiveness. Ingrid wasn't ready to hand that over yet. Not fully. Not with so much still unexplained sitting cold between them. But it was something, a start maybe. Same as the log split clean by a swing that didn't need anger behind it. She went upstairs. Sat on the edge of her bed a long while, letters still clutched in her hand, listening to the house settle into its nighttime creaks around her. Because some cruel, insistent part of her mind wouldn't stop running the arithmetic. Gideon knew Rourke. Rourke threatened Eric. Eric died in a fire. Nobody ever explained. Which meant except it didn't mean anything yet, not for certain. And she knew that, knew it the way she knew most true things, cold and unwelcome, in the pit of her stomach. Knowing a man once wasn't the same as sending him to burn a barn. Being hired by a devil didn't make every man who'd ever taken the devil's coin into a devil himself. Until she thought of Eric's face, the one memory she still had trouble reaching for without her chest going tight at his laugh. That easy, unhurried laugh. Gone now 18 months and never back, and arithmetic started up all over again. Unbidden, merciless. She made herself stop, made herself breathe, made herself remember the particular careful way Gideon had looked at her every single day since he'd ridden up that drive steady, unflinching, seeing her, and only her, in a county that had spent a decade seeing everything about her except the person standing underneath the size of her. That wasn't nothing. Whatever else was true, that wasn't nothing. She folded the letter back into the ledger, blew out the lamp, and lay awake a long while longer than she meant to, listening for footsteps in the yard that never came. Because Gideon, for all his faults and all his unfinished confessions, had never once, not on his worst night, come to her door uninvited. Small mercies. She was learning to count them one at a time, the way everything else on this ranch had ever demanded of her. Reyes came at dusk, 2 days later, alone, no horse, on foot through the tree line like a man who didn't want the sound of hooves announcing him before he was ready. Ingrid nearly took his head off with the shotgun before she recognized him in the failing light. "Easy," Reyes said. "Hands up, quick. Easy. Not here for trouble. You've got about 4 seconds to explain why you're sneaking through my tree line at dusk, Reyes, before I decide trouble found you anyway. Doss is planning something. Bigger than fences. Bigger than a called note." Reyes's voice had none of its usual swagger in it now, just something tight and urgent underneath. "He knows about the spring. Has for a while. Longer than I realized. And he's done waiting on paperwork to get it. When? Soon. A week? Maybe 2, not longer than that. And he's bringing more men than fences this time." Ingrid's stomach went cold. "Why, tell me this. You work for him." Reyes was quiet a moment, looking past her, toward the barn, toward the loft where a lamp had just been lit. His hands had come down from where he'd held them up, and he twisted his hat brim between them, now instead. A nervous habit she'd never once seen from him before, not even the day Gideon had stared him down in her own yard. "Man I used to be," he said. "Wasn't. Always. Doss's man. Rode with a different out once. Years back. Up in the Panhandle. Bad winter, line shack caught fire in the middle of it. 3 of us trapped in snow too deep to run, and no water within a mile to fight it with. Should have died in there. All 3 of us. Should have. What happened? Man rode up out of nowhere. Didn't know him, never got his name. Pulled the beam off my leg with his bare hands, dragged me clear. Went back in twice more for the other 2. No reason to risk it. Wasn't his outfit. Wasn't his men. Wasn't a dollar in it for him anywhere. Just did it because it needed doing, and then rode on before any of us thought to properly thank him. Your man in there," he said, nodding toward the barn, toward the loft, where the lamp burned steady. "Calloway. Something about him's been sitting wrong with me since the day he first stood in your yard. Couldn't place it. Place it now, though. Recognized it 2 nights back, finally, when I saw him from a distance in town, standing just so, hand resting near his hip the exact way that man's had. Same way he stood outside that burning line shack, like the fire hadn't cost him a thing to walk into." Ingrid felt something shift in her chest, something she didn't have time to examine, not with Reyes's news, sitting cold and urgent between them. "You're certain it's him?" "Certain enough." Reyes glanced back toward the tree line, shoulders tight, a man clearly aware of how much time he'd already spent standing somewhere his own boss would call betrayal. "I owe a debt I never got to pay. Figured this was as close as I'll get to paying it. So take the warning. It's the truest thing I've got left to give you. Doss isn't sending Cobb and me next time. He's bringing outside guns. Men who don't know this county, don't care about it, won't hesitate the way I might." "Why would you hesitate?" Reyes didn't answer that directly, just looked at her a long moment, something almost apologetic in his face, before he said, "Been thinking on it, is all. Whether every dollar Doss pays is worth what it's starting to cost me to keep earning it." He was gone before Ingrid could ask another question, swallowed back into the tree line, the way he'd come, leaving her standing alone in the yard with a warning that changed everything, and a name she hadn't spoken, Gideon's hands hanging unconfirmed in the dark air between 2 debts neither man had finished paying. She turned toward the barn, toward the lamp burning steady in the loft window. "A week, maybe 2, Reyes had said. And somewhere behind that lamp, A man with 52 ghosts and one unfinished confession was about to find out exactly how much of his past had finally ridden up the drive to collect what it was owed. Morning came gray and still, the kind of stillness that didn't feel peaceful so much as held, like the whole county was waiting on something. Like even the birds had decided quiet was the safer choice today. Ingrid found Gideon already in the yard, checking the Colt's cylinder by lamplight, though the sun was well up by then, a habit she'd noticed he fell into whenever his hands needed something to do, besides sit idle and let his thoughts catch up to him. Didn't sleeps, she said. Not a question. Some liar. Fair, Gideon admitted, and there was the faintest shadow of a smile in it, the first she'd seen from him since the letter. Didn't sleep much. Kept thinking on what I owed you, and how little of it I've managed to pay. You don't owe me anything you haven't already given. I owe you the truth. Whole of it. Not pieces handed over one uncomfortable night at a time. Ingrid sat down on the porch step beside him. Close enough to talk. Close enough, she realized, without quite deciding to let it be true, that the careful distance she'd been keeping since the argument had shrunk down to almost nothing. Overnight. Then give it to me, she said. All of it. Whatever's left. Gideon set the Colt down, looked out at the fields, gone silver-gray in the early light, and when he spoke again, his voice had none of its usual careful distance in it. Rourke ran a hard outfit, he said. Harder than most. I did jobs for him. I'm not proud of moved families off land they'd worked honest. More than once. Because Rourke paid well, and I'd decided, somewhere along the way, that asking too many questions was a luxury a working man couldn't afford. Doss was there for some of it, watching, learning. I expect he learned considerably more from Rourke than either one of us realized at the time, judging by how he's running his own outfit now. Did you know him doing that? To families like Eric's. I never touched your husband's land, Ingrid. Never came within 100 miles of this county. Not once, in all my years with Rourke's outfit. That much I can swear to, and I'd stake whatever's left of my name on it. He was quiet a moment. But I can't swear Rourke's men didn't learn the trick from watching me work somewhere else first. That's the part I can't hand you clean. That's the part I've got to carry, whatever you decide to do with the rest of it. Ingrid looked at him a long moment, at the honesty sitting plain and unguarded on his face. No careful door closing this time. Nothing held back. I believe you, she said finally. About Eric. About never touching this land before. And the rest. The rest, Ingrid said, is a debt you're already paying. Every day you stay. Every fence you mend. That isn't yours to mend. I don't need you clean, Gideon. Nobody who's lived long enough to matter is clean. I just needed you honest. And you finally are. Something moved through his face then, relief. Maybe, or something bigger than relief, something that didn't have a tidy name and said anything at all. The silence between them settled and easy, in a way it hadn't been in days. Except Ingrid's mind wouldn't quite let it rest there, because forgiving a thing and forgetting a thing weren't the same animal at all. Whatever the preachers liked to claim from the pulpit on Sunday mornings, she'd forgiven him. She was fairly certain of that much. But some small, watchful part of her, the part that had learned, the hard way, exactly how much a person could hide behind a kind face and a careful silence, that part was still standing at the window, still counting exits, still waiting to see whether honesty, once finally offered, would hold up under weather, which wasn't fair to him. She knew that too. Man had just handed her the ugliest parts of himself on a porch step at dawn, and here she was, still quietly auditing the receipt, until she caught herself doing it and made herself stop, because a person could spend a whole lifetime waiting for proof that never arrived, and she'd already spent 2 years proving to herself she could survive without wadding on anybody. Maybe it was time to learn the harder lesson instead, the one about trusting somebody standing right in front of you, ghosts and all, before the proof ever fully arrived. Reyes said a week, maybe 2, Ingrid said finally. Then we'd best make the days count. How do we do that? Exactly. 12 of us against however many outside guns Doss can afford to hire. We don't fight his numbers, Gideon said. We fight his patience. Man like Doss, everything he's built, runs on people folding quiet and fast. Give him a fight that cost him time, cost him money, cost him the easy reputation he's spent years building in his territory. That's a different kind of pressure than a gun ever was. Banknote, sheriff, neighbors banding together. Every piece of that costs him something he actually values. And if patience isn't enough, then we've got Otis's rifle and Abel's aim and every ounce of strength you've spent a lifetime being told to be ashamed of, Gideon said. Reckon that's a considerable amount of. Enough when it all stands in 1 yard together. Otis Fenwick arrived 2 mornings later, and he arrived the way. Old soldiers arrived without warning, without apology, and with a rifle slung across his back that had clearly seen more use than most men's entire lives put together. Abel spotted him first, coming up the main road at an easy walk, leading his horse rather than riding it, a man in no particular hurry, despite the dust and the distance he'd plainly covered. "Friend of yours?" Ingrid asked, watching Gideon's face change the moment. The stranger came into clear view surprise, then something that looked, for the first time since she'd known him, uncomplicated and entirely glad. "Otis Fenwick," Gideon said, already moving toward the gate. "Rode scout with me, years back through the war, and the rough frontier years just after it. Hadn't laid eyes on him in 11 years. The 2 men gripped forearms in the yard, the particular greeting of men who'd once trusted each other with their lives and never quite lost the habit of it, and Otis looked Gideon up and down, with an expression somewhere between amusement and disbelief. "Heard a rumor," Otis said, "that the Sabine man had gone soft, mending fences, minding cattle. Figured I'd come see it for myself before I believed it." "Believe it," Gideon said. "Don't look soft to me. Look like a man about to walk into more trouble than he's owned up to in a letter that took me 3 weeks to track down. You got my letter." "Got it. Read it twice, saddled up, before I finished the second reading." Otis's eyes moved to Ingrid then, taking her in her full height. The shotgun she still hadn't fully set down since he'd appeared on the road, and unlike most men, he didn't linger there, didn't measure her twice. Just nodded, respectful, the way he might have nodded at any commanding officer he'd trust with his life. "Ma'am," he said, "heard a great deal about you in that letter. Man doesn't usually write 3 pages about a fence-mending job." Ingrid glanced at Gideon, who had for once the decency to look faintly embarrassed. "3 pages," she said. "Might have been 4, Otis said, grinning. "Man's always been long-winded when something's actually got hold of him." "Otis, just saying what's true, same as you'd tell anybody." Despite herself, despite the gray stillness of the last 2 days, Ingrid felt something like a laugh work loose in her chest, unexpected and welcome. "He said you rode scout together," she said, "during the war." "Rode scout. Pulled each other out of worse scrapes than I care to count." Otis's grin faded into something steadier. "Man saved my life twice, that I'm keeping careful track of. Once at a river crossing I won't bore you with, and once in a ravine that still gives me bad dreams on quiet nights. Whatever trouble's coming for this ranch, ma'am, I'd consider it a personal insult if you didn't let me stand here. And even the debt out some. We could use the rifle," Ingrid said. "And whatever else you've got." "Got a great deal else," Otis said. "Spent the last 11 years training cavalry recruits how not to die stupid. Figured that particular skill might finally come in handy for something that isn't the Army's business." They sat that evening, around the fire. Abel insisted on building, despite the mild weather, because a fire, he claimed, made planning feel more official, and Otis told stories, careful ones, the kind a man tells when he's deciding how much of the truth a new audience can hold. "River crossing," he said, when Ingrid asked. "Spring of '68. Current higher than anybody accounted for, and my horse went down under me, and I went under with it. Would have drowned plain and simple, except this one." He nodded at Gideon, who was studying his own boots with the particular intensity of a man, hoping the subject would change on its own. "This one didn't wait for orders. Didn't wait for sense either, given how cold that water was. Just went in, after me. Hauled me out by the collar like a drowned cat, and never once mentioned it again. Had to hear the whole story from another scout, weeks later, because Gideon here apparently considered it too unremarkable to bring up himself. That sounds like him, Ingrid said. Does it now? Fixed my well the first night he arrived. Never mentioned it either. I found out 'cause I went looking for the bucket. Man's got a bad habit of doing the remarkable thing and calling it Tuesday. Otis agreed. Ravine was worse, if you want the honest accounting. Ambush, 3 of us pinned down, no cover worth mentioning, and this one held the position alone long enough for the rest of the patrol to get clear, then walked out selves, without so much as a limp to show for it. Officers wanted to write him up for a commendation. He refused the paperwork. Said commendations were for men who wanted their names remembered, and he decided somewhere back that he didn't. Why not? Ingrid asked, looking at Gideon now, who had given up on his boots and taken to studying the fire instead. Because a remembered name, Gideon said quiet, is a name men come looking for. Had learned that lesson twice already, the hard way. Wasn't eager for a third. Man spent half his life running from being noticed. Somehow still manages to be the most noticeable person in every room he walks into. Never did work out the trick of that. It's not a trick, Ingrid said. It's just true. Otis looked between the two of them a long moment, something knowing settling into his expression, and didn't say whatever he was clearly thinking. Just tossed another log on the fire and let the subject pass, the way an old friend knows exactly when a thing is better left unsaid out loud. Word spread fast after that. The way trouble and hope both traveled fast in a county, running short on rain and patience in equal measure. Hollis Pruitt came back within the week, and this time he didn't come alone. 4 other outfits rode in behind him over the following days, singly and in pairs, men and their grown sons mostly, weathered and grim and entirely done with waiting to see how far Warwick Doss intended to push before somebody pushed back. Ingrid stood in her own yard one evening, watching a dozen strange horses grazing alongside her own, watching men she'd barely spoken to in 3 years of quiet isolation sit around fires they'd built without asking permission, and felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not alone. For the first time in longer than she wanted to count, not alone. Never seen this many folks on timberline land at once, Abel said, coming to stand beside her, spectacles pushed up on his forehead the better to squint at the gathering fires. Not since your wedding, if memory serves. And my memory serves less reliable every year, so don't hold me to it. Eric would have liked this, Ingrid said. Quiet. Hated being alone in a fight. Always. Said a ranch was only as strong as the neighbors willing to ride for it. Man had sense, Abel said. Shame the good ones always seem to leave too early, and the mean ones stick around forever. Ingrid didn't have an answer for that, just watched the fires burn and the horses graze, and felt, for the first time since the fire took her husband, like the weight on her shoulders had finally found other shoulders willing to share it. She walked among the fires that night, slow, unhurried, and found herself stopping at Pruitt's, where 3 of his sons sat sharpening tools that had no particular need of sharpening, the kind of restless work men did with their hands when their minds needed somewhere else to be. Mrs. Voss, the eldest boy, no more than 20, scrambled up too fast, nearly upending his own supper. Didn't mean to make free with your land like this. Pa said. Your pa was right to bring you, Ingrid said. Sit, please. He sat, cautious, eyes going wide the way most men's did on first meeting her, quick and involuntary, before he caught himself and settled his gaze somewhere closer to ordinary. Never thanked you proper, he said, for the water. My little sister's been sickly all summer, on account of what we've had to drink from that Willow Creek mud puddle we've been calling a well. Ma says once your spring's running full, she figures Sarah'll be strong again by Christmas. Ingrid felt something catch in her throat that she hadn't expected. I didn't do it alone, she said. Wasn't even my doing, most of it. Land just happened to be sitting on something worth protecting. Still had to be the one willing to protect it, the boy said, with the plain, unpolished honesty of the very young. A lot of folks would have sold out easy. 3 days into what you went through. Ma says that took more backbone than most men in this county have got. Put together. Ingrid didn't have a ready answer for that either. Just nodded, quiet, and moved on to the next fire, carrying the boy's words with her the rest of the evening, like something warm held carefully against the cold. The sheriff's undoing came almost gently in the end, which surprised Ingrid more than the confrontation itself. Marta's testimony, once she was willing to give it plain and formal rather than whispered in an alley doorway, was enough on its own. But it wasn't alone for long. Two of Pruitt's men had seen the same handoffs behind the jailhouse, different nights, same money changing hands. And Otis, it turned out, had a talent beyond scouting, a careful, patient way of asking questions in a saloon that got men talking more than they meant to. And within 3 days, he'd found a bank clerk willing to swear, quietly, that Ferris had deposited sums no honest sheriff's salary could explain. The territorial judge rode in from the county seat on a Thursday, unhurried, unimpressed by Dawson's reputation and or his money worth, and Sheriff Amos Ferris found himself relieved of his badge before the sun had fully set that same evening. "You'll regret this," Ferris told Ingrid, on his way out of the jailhouse for the last time, badge already gone from his vest. "I regret a great many things, Mr. Ferris," Ingrid said. "Trusting you with this county's safety isn't going to be one of going forward, seeing as you're no longer in a position to be trusted with it." He didn't have an answer for that. Just walked off down the street, smaller somehow without the badge, and Ingrid felt no particular satisfaction watching him go. Just a quiet, settled relief, the kind that came from one less lie standing between her and whatever was coming next. The new sheriff, a quiet, capable man named Caleb Odom, appointed temporary by the judge until an election could be properly held, rode out to Timberline himself the following morning, alone, unarmed but for the badge on his vest. "Judge wants it understood," he said, "that whatever's coming from Dawson's direction, the law's watching now. Watching close. He tries anything inside county lines, there'll be a marshal's inquiry behind it within the week, and this time, nobody's paying to make that inquiry disappear. That supposed to stop him? No," Odom admitted. "Don't imagine it will. Man like Doss, this deep into what he wants, the law showing up late usually just changes how careful he is about the mess he leaves behind. But it means when the mess is finished, there won't be nobody left standing to help him bury it quiet. It wasn't everything, but it was something, same as most things had been lately, small mercies, stacking up slow, the way good things sometimes did, after a long enough stretch of only bad ones showing up. The night before Doss came, nobody slept much, and Abel, of all people, was the one who insisted on a proper supper anyway. "Man can't fight well on an empty stomach," he announced, setting a pot of something that smelled considerably better than his coffee ever managed onto the table. "Learned that much in 70 years, even if I haven't learned much else worth passing on." "You've learned plenty worth passing on," Ingrid said. "Name one thing." "Never trust a banker with kind eyes. That's just good sense, not wisdom." "Never split wood angry." Gideon, across the table, allowed himself the smallest of smiles. "That one's mine, if I recall." "Stolen fair and square," Ingrid said. "Finder's rights. There's no such thing as finder's rights on wisdom, Ingrid." "There is tonight." Abel looked between the two of them, something fond and exasperated crossing his weathered face. "Lord help whatever children this county produces next generation, having to live up to the pair of you, bickering like an old married couple before you've even—" He stopped himself. Ingrid felt her face go warm despite everything, and across the table, Gideon suddenly found his supper bowl deeply, thoroughly fascinating. "Eat your supper, old man," Ingrid said, "before I decide. Your wisdom's run its course for the evening." "See," Abel said, entirely unbothered, ladling himself a second helping. "Married already. Just haven't sent for the preacher yet." Nobody argued the point, which was, Ingrid thought later, lying awake and listening to the house settle into whatever the next day would bring, its own kind of answer. Doss came at dawn 4 days later, exactly the way Reyes had warned he would. Ingrid heard the horses, Before, she saw them a great many horses, more than Cobb and Reyes alone could ever have accounted for, and she was up and dressed and standing in the yard with the shotgun in her hands before the first rider crested the rise on the main road. Her heart was going hard, because this was it. Because every note called, every fence cut, every quiet threat nailed to a post had been leading here to this exact gray morning, and there was room left for waiting it out, which meant no more time to be afraid in private, tucked away where nobody could see it, which meant whatever fear she had left needed converting, fast, into something a body could actually use. Gideon was already beside her, Otis a step behind, rifle steady, and behind them, scattered along the fence lines and the barn and the low-rise past the well, more than a dozen men from 4 different outfits, armed and grim and waiting, because word had gone out 2 nights past that today, most likely, was the day. Doss rode at the front, flanked by 8 men Ingrid didn't recognize, hard-faced, unhurried, the particular kind of stillness that came from being paid well to not ask questions, same as Gideon had once been paid, years and a whole lifetime ago. Cobb and Reyes rode near the back. Ingrid noted, with a coldness she hadn't expected of herself, that Reyes's hand rested near his hip in a way that looked considerably more thoughtful than threatening. Doss reined in 30 feet out, looked at the gathered ranchers, the fence lines, the sheer number of guns arrayed against the 8 he'd brought, and something flickered across his face, not fear exactly. Doss didn't strike Ingrid as a man built for fear, but recalculation. The look of a man discovering, too late, that his arithmetic had been wrong from the start. Mrs. Voss. His voice was still smooth, still practiced, but there was a strain under it now that hadn't been there in the mercantile weeks ago. I see you've collected quite a gathering. Neighbors, Ingrid said. Turns out I have more of them than either of us realized. This doesn't need to end in bloodshed. No, Ingrid agreed, it doesn't. That's entirely up to you. Doss's eyes moved to Gideon then. Lingered. Something old and calculating passed behind them. You, he said. I remember you now. Took me a while, but I remember. Rourke's man. The quiet one who never asked what happened to the families after. I'm asking now, Gideon said. Bit late for most of them. Not too late for this one. Sentiment, Doss said, was always going to be your weakness. Rourke used to say so. Said a man who starts caring what happens to the people he's hired to move along stops being useful for the job. Suits me fine, Gideon said. Wasn't looking to be useful for that job ever again. Doss's hand drifted slowly toward his own weapon, more instinct than intention, the way a cornered man's hand often did. Ingrid felt every part of her go very still. Felt the old, familiar arithmetic start up in her chest, count the guns, count the distance, count the seconds it would take a dozen men to react. If the morning tipped wrong, except underneath the arithmetic, something else was happening too. Something steadier. Because she'd spent 2 years believing her size was a burden the world had saddled her with. Something to apologize for. Something to make herself smaller around. And standing here now, watching Warwick Doss's hand hover near his holster, she understood, with a clarity that arrived all at once and stayed, that she had never once needed to make herself smaller. Not for this, not for any of it. That was when Ingrid stepped forward. Not toward Doss. Toward the well, the ordinary well, the one Gideon had cleared of sabotage his very first morning, and in one motion, without hurry, without effort, that showed on her face. She gripped the heavy iron, well cover, 300 pounds if it was an ounce, and swung it up and around, like it weighed nothing at all, planting it flat between herself and the nearest of Doss's outside guns as a shield the width of a door. The move startled the whole yard into stillness. Horses shied. Men who'd never once seen what a woman built, on Ingrid's scale, could actually do, when the moment finally demanded it, found themselves recalculating in real time. The same recalculation every face at once. You want this creek, Ingrid said, voice carrying flat and clear across the yard. You're going to have to come through more than 8 men, and a smile can manage. Because there's a dozen guns behind me, who've got nothing left to lose to your kind of trouble. And there's a woman standing in front of you who can put an iron well chest at 40 feet if the morning calls for it. That's not possible. One of Doss's outside men muttered, low, uncertain. Ask him, Ingrid said, nodding toward Gideon, whether I make idle threats. She doesn't, Gideon said. Not one time. In 3 months I've known her. It was, Ingrid would think later, the precise moment the whole yard tipped. Not the guns, not the numbers, though the numbers mattered plenty. The moment itself, the sheer, undeniable fact of her, standing there unafraid, using every ounce of a size the whole county had spent years turning into shame, turning it instead into the one thing that made 8 hired guns from outside the territory start doing arithmetic none of them liked the answer to. Doss's hand stopped halfway to his holster. Cobb. Reyes. His voice had gone thin, urgent. Take position on the Reyes didn't move. Reyes, Doss said again. Sharper. No, sir, Reyes said quiet, and every head in the yard turned toward him at once. I believe I'm done taking your orders, Mr. Doss. Been thinking on it a good while now. Today didn't seem a good a day as any to finish thinking. Cobb looked at his partner like the ground had shifted under both of them at once, which, in a sense, it had. You're going to regret that, Doss said. Maybe, Reyes agreed. Man's owed a debt, though, and a debt doesn't stop being owed just because paying it costs a job. Figured I'd rather live with an empty pocket than another year of nights I can't sleep through. The outside guns, Ingrid noticed, had gone very still, watching their own ranks fracture in real time, watching the numbers they'd been promised shrink by one right in front of them, and uncertainty had a way of spreading through hired men faster than courage ever did. One of them, a lean man with a scar through his eyebrow, glanced sideways Haber, some silent calculation passing between them about exactly how much money was worth what was about to happen if this went the way it was starting to look like it might go. Last chance, Mr. Doss, Ingrid said. Ride out. Take whatever's left of your outfit with you, or find out exactly how far a woman my size is willing to go to keep what's hers. Doss looked at the yard, at the well cover, still held steady in Ingrid's grip, at Gideon's stillness, at Utta's grim rifles who'd driven half a day, each to be standing exactly here, at Reyes, and now following his lead, at Cobb too, lowering his hands slow, and at the 8 outside, men who'd been paid for a fight they were rapidly losing their appetite for. Something in his face finally cracked. Not surrender, not entirely, but close enough to it. This isn't finished, he said. It is for today, Ingrid said. Whether that's finished enough for you is your own arithmetic to settle. He wheeled his horse, rode out, his outside men following, in a loose, uncertain line that had none of the confidence they'd arrived with, and the whole yard stood watching. The dust settle long and Alstom hooves had faded past the main road. Nobody moved for a long moment after that. Nobody quite trusted the quiet yet, until Abel finally let out a long, shaking breath and said, to nobody in particular, well, don't reckon this county's ever seen a well cover used quite like that before, and something in the absurdity of it broke the tension wide open. A ragged, relieved laugh moving through the gathered ranchers like the first crack of rain after a long drought. Ingrid set the well cover down, careful, her arms only now beginning to register what she'd asked of them, and found Gideon watching her with an expression she'd never once seen on his face before. Not surprise, not admiration exactly, something quieter and larger than either. You didn't need any of us out here today, he said. Did you? No, Ingrid admitted. But I'm awful glad you all came anyway. Cobb and Reyes stayed behind. Figured we'd best explain ourselves to the new sheriff, Reyes said, before Doss gets there first with his own version of events. Smart, Gideon said. Learned it, somewhere, Reyes said, and something passed between the two men then. Unspoken, a debt acknowledged, and in its own quiet way, considered settled. The territorial judge, informed, within the week of a full accounting, Ferris's bribes, the diverted creek, the sabotaged well, the called note pushed through by a bribed banker, and Doss's own outside guns fleeing, rather than face a county's worth of armed neighbors with considerably more speed than county business usually managed. Warwick Doss's cattle route contracts were suspended pending formal review. His credit with the regional bank, once his greatest weapon, dried up faster than any creek in the county that summer, once word traveled about exactly how he'd tried to use it. He left the territory before the month was out. Nobody in Rimrock Hollow much mourned the leaving. Ingrid rode into town herself the following week for the first time since the confrontation, and found the whole rhythm of the street had shifted in ways she hadn't expected. Mr. Callahan came out from the mercantile before she'd even climbed down from the wagon, hat already off. Mrs. Voss. His eyes went to her face and stayed there, same as they always had, careful and correct, except there was something new in his expression now, not the careful courtesy of a man managing his own discomfort, but something closer to plain respect. Whole town's talking about what happened out at Timberline. Man came through selling feed, said the stories already made it 3 counties over. Woman who stood down Warwick Doss with nothing but her own 2 hands in a well cover. Wasn't nothing but my own 2 hands, Ingrid said. Had a dozen neighbors standing with me. Had Gideon. Had Otis's rifle. Heard that too. Heard you didn't need any of it, though, by most accounts, and offered it a home anyway. Callahan shifted his weight, something almost sheepish, crossing his face. Wanted to say, and I don't say it easy, given how many years I've walked past you on this street, without saying much of anything worth remembering, wanted to say, I'm sorry for the years this town spent making you feel like something to whisper about, instead of something to be proud of. Wasn't right. Should have said different things, out loud, a long while back. Ingrid looked at him a long moment. At the genuine discomfort in his admission, the kind that cost a man something to offer. Thank you, Mr. Callahan, she said. That means considerably more than you might expect. She walked the rest of the street slower than she had in years, unhurried, and noticed, here and there, small shifts. She hadn't expected to notice a woman who nodded instead of looking away, a child who waved rather than stared and got pulled along quiet, a general sense, subtle but unmistakable, of a town recalculating what it had spent a decade assuming about the woman who lived alone on 400 acres at the edge of the county. It wasn't everything. Old habits, old whispers didn't disappear overnight, just because a woman had once used a well cover to remind a whole yard of hired guns exactly what she was capable of. But it was a start, and Ingrid found she'd stopped needing it to be more than that. That same evening, riding back through her own gate, she found herself walking up to the rise behind the barn instead of straight to the house alone, for the first time in longer than she could properly account for, without letting herself stop at the bottom of the slope the way she usually did. 2 small stones sat quiet under grass, gone gold with the season, and beside them a larger one, Eric's name carved plain and unadorned the way he'd have wanted it. No flourishes, no borrowed poetry, just a name and 2 dates and the simple fact of a life that had mattered. We're all right, she told him, quiet, the way she hadn't quite managed to do in 2 years of standing at the bottom of this rise, instead of walking all the way up it, held onto the land. Held onto the spring you never told me about, you stubborn, secretive man. And I found somebody, Eric. Wasn't looking, wasn't sure I ever would again. But I found somebody who looks at me the way you always did, like there was nowhere else worth looking. The wind moved soft through the grass, and somewhere down past the barn, she could hear Gideon's low voice talking to the horses, unhurried, the same patient rhythm he brought to everything. I think you'd have liked him, she said. Think you'd have argued with him plenty, both of you being stubborn in your own particular ways. But I think you'd have liked him all the same. She stood there a while longer, until the light went fully gold, and then fully gone, and walked back down the rise lighter than she'd walked up it, the way grief sometimes lets you go, not all at once, never all at once, but in small, generous pieces, offered up exactly when you were finally ready to receive them. Autumn came slow and gold that year, the drought finally breaking in a run of proper rains that filled every creek in the county. Timberlines spring, feeding steady into all of them once the old capped stonework was reopened. Careful and deliberate shared water for a dozen outfits who'd once stood at a distance from each other and now didn't. Ingrid stood on her porch one evening, watching the last light go copper over land that was, for the first time, in longer than she could properly measure, entirely at peace. "Town's talking about you different now," Abel said, settling into the chair beside her with a cup of coffee that had, against all odds, finally started tasting almost drinkable. Heard Mrs. Callahan telling her sister, "You're the reason half the ranch is out past Willow Crock still have water into winter. Called you a marvel." Actual word she used. Marvel. Marvel, Ingrid repeated, testing the word, unfamiliar and strange, and she found not unwelcome. "Better than giantess," Abel said. "Considerably better." Gideon came up from the barn as the sun dropped the last of its light behind the ridge, and he didn't say anything at first, just settled onto the porch, step below her, the way he had most evenings now, close enough that Ingrid had stopped pretending the closeness was accidental. "Otis rides out tomorrow," he said. "Says he's found himself a taste for ranch work, though. Might come back once he's settled his own affairs elsewhere. He'd be welcome. Told him as much." Otis himself found them there a few minutes later, saddlebags already packed, and stood at the bottom of the porch. Steps a moment before speaking, the particular hesitation of a man unused to saying goodbye out loud. "Figured I'd say it proper before I ride," he said. "Been a long while since I fought alongside anybody worth the trouble. Longer still since I watched a man finally stop running from whatever's been chasing him. Glad I got to see it. Both of it." "You're welcome back anytime," Ingrid said. "This ranch could use a man who trains recruits not to die stupid. Seems like a considerable improvement over most of the help I've had. Might take you up on that." Otis looked at Gideon a long moment, something unspoken passing between the two old friends, the kind of understanding that didn't need translating into words. "Take care of her, and let her take care of you some too. Man's allowed both." "Working on it," Gideon said. "Work faster. You're 38, not 18. Life's shorter than either one of us used to think it was, back when we were young enough to believe otherwise." He swung up onto his horse, tipped his hat once, and rode off down the main road in the last of the daylight, and Ingrid found she already missed him, the easy warmth he'd brought into a house that had gone quiet and careful for far too long. They sat quiet a while, watching the stars come up slow over land that had cost them both more than either one wanted to count, and finally said the thing she'd been turning over for weeks now, careful, unhurried, the way she'd learned, watching him, that the truest things were usually said. "I used to think," she said, "that being built the way I am meant I'd always be standing apart from things. Too much for an ordinary life. Too much for an ordinary room. And now? Now, I think maybe I was just waiting on the right people to build a bigger room." Gideon looked up at her, steady, the way he'd looked at her since the very first night, and there was nothing careful left in his face at all. No doors half closed, no unfinished sentences, nothing held back. "I'd like to help build it," he said, "if you'll have the help." 52 ghosts in all?" 52 ghosts in all, he agreed. "Reckon they're quieter these days, anyhow. Reckon they finally found a fight worth all that old trouble." Ingrid reached down, and he took her hand, and it was, she thought, a strange and ordinary and entirely unremarkable thing. Two hands closing together at the end of a long day, except nothing about it felt small at all. Felt, instead, like exactly the right size for everything either one of them had left to build. Somewhere out past the barn, an owl called once, and this time nobody in that yard had any reason left to fear what the dark might be bringing. The land was quiet, the water ran clean, and for the first time since she'd buried her husband on the rise behind the barn, Ingrid Voss sat on her own porch in the town that had once called her every unkind name it could find, and let herself, finally, simply be at home in the size of her own life.